Hey, everyone, and welcome to the YoJoeShow podcast. Hey, Joe.
Hey yo, how you doing?
Good. How was your weekend?
Everything's great, man. Heart's beating, lungs are working, everything's doing terrific. Glad to be
Awesome.
here.
Yeah, although I guess the heart's beating and lungs are running, not for some very unfortunate people in India, and that's unfortunately the very sad beginning to this episode.
Yeah, we have some topics I know we want to cover. The India terror attack, that's definitely one of them. It's interesting because JD Vance was just in India and there's
Yeah, this actually happened while he was there, so
yeah, him and his wife's actually Indian, of Indian descent. She was born in the United States, but so we're going to be talking about that today. And there's actually a trade agreement in the works with India to massively increase our trade with them. So this is certainly is not a great thing that this happened all while the United States was being represented there. And then we can talk a little bit about, we want to bring up the US aircraft carrier that had a visit from a Russian plane. And then we have a whole bunch of other things. I know we want to talk about some of the hypocrisy and maybe less than straightforward thinking that happens sometimes with our politicians. They say one thing and they may do another. What
Mhm.
else we want to talk about?
Yeah, I think it'll definitely be a fascinating conversation. Just to get us started, for a little context, the terror attack occurred in a region of India called Kashmir. Now, notable regarding this region is the larger Kashmir area is disputed between three countries: Pakistan, India, and China. And it's actually controlled by three different countries. So the Chinese have one part along their border, the Pakistanis have part along their border, and then the majority is controlled by the Indians. The area where the attack happened is it's a tourist meadow, and it's only accessible by foot or by horseback, which made it really complicated for the immediate response efforts. But rumor has it that there were four Islamic terrorists who came through Pakistan, or at least through the Pakistani part of Kashmir, and they started shooting and massacring these people in this field. It's considered India's Switzerland because of how beautiful the mountainous areas there are and the views and the grasslands. So it was just tourists on vacation, mostly Indian tourists, although one Nepalese tourist was killed. So I think there were 25 Indians and one Nepali citizen, and at least 17 more were injured, many of them in critical condition. And it was just horrifying because watching those videos were very reminiscent of October 7th, just watching people who were there to celebrate and party and enjoy life. In Israel, it was a music festival. Here, just literally kids jumping on trampolines in a field. And then these vicious terrorists come and just start shooting and massacring the people there. Unfortunately, this has received basically zero coverage whatsoever in international news, and that is sad. I guess no Jews, no news, but it's just a horrific situation, and we felt that it's probably important to bring it to people's attention because I've literally seen zero Western coverage of the topic aside from a few posts on X. Most people would be completely oblivious to this happening. This has been the worst terror attack in India since the 2008 Mumbai attacks. Notably, there are some of the terrorists from the same terror organization called Kashmir Resistance. There are two terrorist organizations associated with this attack. One is called the Resistance Front, and the other is called Era Ataibe and or Hizbul Mujahideen. And these terrorists, LET, the Lashkar Taiba, are the same ones who conducted the 2008 massacre, where about 170 people were massacred in 5 different attack centers. It was the largest and biggest international hotel in Mumbai, and then the Chabad House, which is a Jewish outreach location where not a local, but a Jewish family was there to help Israeli tourists. And the terrorists went in there and they conquered the building, and there was a hostage situation. They murdered the rabbi and his wife. Their 2-year-old child was for hours and hours playing over the body of his parents. The child's name was Moses, and he was, yeah, just basically a gut wrenching situation where he's crying for his parents until one of the local Indian women who would take care of him, like his nanny, was able to grab him and sneak him out, even though there was a hostage situation. She knew some back exit, and she was able to release these people. But there was these crazy hostage situations that lasted probably like a day or two before the Indian special forces were able to take control both of the synagogue kind of religious center, Jewish religious center, as well as the hotel. So that was in 2008. This is the same terror organization with notable ties to the ISI, which is the Pakistani military intelligence. They worked with the CIA for many years and the US State Department. It's funny because they're also notable for funding and training many terrorist organizations. And the US was working with them to help them combat terrorism. But it's like the ISI was speaking with both sides of their mouth and working with both sides. So they would take American money, but then they would also help Islamic terror. But they coordinated with the US for a very long time, and there were very close relationships there. But it is just ironic how many times the CIA, like we saw in Afghanistan, where they funded Al Qaeda originally when Al Qaeda was funding the Taliban, and they literally traded Osama bin Laden. We don't have a very good track record because the ISI is one of the bigger sponsors of terror. Pakistan in general, after Iran, is one of the notable sponsors of terror around the world. And yeah, it's just very sad situation. The tensions are very high between India and Pakistan. So the result, what India did immediately is they kicked out like 600,000 Pakistani Muslims who were there on visa, and they were just like gone. It's funny. Israel is blamed 70, 80 years later for the Nakba, which translates as the catastrophe, but is literally the situation when during Israel's independence war, many Palestinians were told by other Arab leaders, as well as by in certain occasions by Israeli military, to leave their towns where they were at. And so for 80 years, that's remembered as this huge crime of the Israelis. But just 6 or 8 months ago, Pakistan did a Nakba as well to 2 million Afghanis who were living in Pakistan, and they just forced them out, evicted them out of the country. And now we're seeing India do the exact same thing. But for some reason, Pakistan did not get any negative attention when it forcefully evicted millions of Muslims, and India isn't getting much negative attention now that they're kicking out hundreds of thousands of Muslims, very understandably. These are not Muslim Indian citizens. These are, again, Pakistanis. But obviously, nobody can forget Israel's horrific crime, where in certain situations, some military units told some Palestinian people to leave their towns. Yeah, like we said earlier, no Jews, no news, but it is just very sad. What are your thoughts on the topic, Joe?
Yeah, we both got a chance to watch some of the actual videos out of there. It's very reminiscent of what happened October 7th in Israel. It's same type of attack, same ruthless, just despicable. We even talked about maybe putting some of that on here, and it's best that we don't, but it can be, anyone can find that online. It's just so inhumane to, this isn't war. This is pure animal brutality. It's horrible. And yes, so they took immediate action in India. They've revoked all the temporary migrant visas, basically, and they asked all the Pakistani nationals to leave the country immediately.
48 hours.
Yep.
Even people who were there for years.
Leave
Get
or
your stuff and leave.
will be detained or removed. They're not taking any chances, and they're showing, obviously, the response from the Pakistani government has been that they're going to do a neutral inquiry and they're going to see what's going on, and they're denying any involvement in what happened. But clearly, it's notable, as you mentioned earlier, that this happened while Vice President Vance and the Second Lady were in India discussing trade, substantial trade advancements with India to massively increase between now and 2030. And I think it's going to be like 500 billion. It's a large sort of discussion as far as the trade back and forth that we'll have between the two countries. And it wouldn't be a surprise that there were people intent on trying to disrupt that. But again, the more important thing is the political or economic side of it. It's just the brutal human loss for no reason. The people that were killed, slaughtered, basically, they had nothing to do with anything. They're just trying to live.
Yeah, and just to note, I doubt that this was because of Vance's visit. Obviously, the timing is not a coincidence, and it was to send a message to the United States. But just a year ago, there was another terror attack in the same region where a bunch of people were killed, also innocent civilians. And maybe 2 or 3 years ago, the same terrorist organization blew up a bus filled with Indian soldiers and killed like 66 Indian soldiers. Yeah, the attacks of these kind of radical Islamists based in Pakistan or the Pakistani region
Sure.
of Kashmir. So yeah, it's an ongoing fight between the terrorists and the Indian military. Last time There was a fight between India and Pakistan. The Indian Air Force actually bombed some of the training, these terrorist training camps in Pakistan itself. So this wasn't in Pakistan and Kashmir, it was in Pakistan itself. And that caused a stir because suddenly you have two nuclear armed militaries bombing within the territory of each other. So yeah, I seriously doubt that this attack happened because of Vance's visit or anything to do with the kind of financial trade or the tariff negotiations or anything like that. It's just the ongoing fight of Islam to conquer India again, as they have in the past. So yeah,
It
it's
wouldn't
just
surprise me, of course, that it would happen regardless. It's just that I'm sure that maybe we're giving too much credit, but they maybe saw an opportune timing to do this.
for
I do
sure.
have queued up the reporting out of India. We can play that and maybe just give some commentary on it.
Sure.
A group called the Resistance Front, or TRF, said through a social media post that they were behind the attack in Kashmir's Pahalgam on 22nd April, which killed at least 28 tourists. According to a notification issued by the Ministry of Home Affairs, TRF is linked to the Pakistan-based terror group called Lashkar-e-Taiba. TRF was formed after Article 370 was struck down in 2019.
And so, if I'm not mistaken, Article 370, which you discuss, was so basically because Kashmir was this disputed territory, the Indian governments gave the two states that India controls within Kashmir some autonomous rights, and Article 370 basically reduced that. And then rumor has it is that India has been moving a whole bunch of Hindus to move into that area to change the demography there as well a little bit. Supposedly, the terrorists claim this is what that is in response to. But like we discussed in previous episodes, overall, radical Muslims want to conquer all of Dar al-Islam, and ultimately, which is the land of any land that was previously Islam, including India and Spain and France and stuff like that, but also the rest of the world, which is considered Dar al-Harb, the house of the sword, which is basically a war zone. It's just very sad. These attacks were happening before these laws came, so the excuse that it's in result to these laws is dubious, in my opinion.
Oh, no, absolutely. Again, it seems that they'll look for any excuse. They'll want to give a reason as why they're doing it, but these types of attacks, there's no excuse for them. We have an interesting clip by someone that I think we're gonna be speaking a little bit about later on. So Humza Yousaf, actually, who is both has ancestry with his parents from Pakistan and India, makes an interesting plea for peace between the two countries. And we'll talk a little later, I think, about some of his other kind of eyebrow-raising comments that he's had, which have been declared to be somewhat racist at the very least. But certainly, let's hear what he has to say, and then we can chime in.
And just for reference, he's a Scottish politician, obviously a Pakistani and Indian kind of family links, but he is a Scottish politician who was the Scottish Prime Minister.
Yeah, former First Minister.
First Minister. Yeah, they have a name, Taoiseach or something, I think, for the Scottish First Minister. So he was the former Scottish First Minister, the first one that was Muslim.
And very outspoken. He speaks publicly all the time and says what he has to say. Let's just listen in as he speaks from his perspective.
Don't let terrorists divide us. A few days ago, we witnessed a horrific terror attack in Pahalgam. As a result of tensions between India and Pakistan now escalating, we're seeing divisions ripple right across our own communities here in the UK. I want to speak from my heart. My grandparents were born in India. My father, he was born in Pakistan. These are both countries that I love. And like so many people of South Asian ancestry, both countries are forever a part of who I am. India and Pakistan share a deep history. We also at times share a deep pain. But we also share a beautiful culture, music, poetry, and language. Rivalry? That's fine, especially when it's about cricket. But hatred, division, violence, that's not who we are.
Yeah, so this was a very beautiful uniting message from Humza Yousaf. I think in this case, he really he's talking the Scottish talk, right, about peace and reconciliation and getting along. But from what we will see in the other clip we have, he tends to walk this Islamist walk a little bit. This is a very nice message. It is also worth noting that point that he brings, because Europe is now huge Pakistani communities as well as large Indian communities. If a serious war breaks out between the two of them, we could see civil wars break out in the streets of Europe. Israel had an interesting similar situation where Israel let in a whole bunch of Sudanese people running away from the civil war there, many of which were Muslims. But Israel let in many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of these Sudanese, and they mostly settled in south of Tel Aviv. And at times there are like civil wars in the streets of southern Tel Aviv. It's pretty rare, but this has happened a bunch of times, between Sudanese who support the former king versus Sudanese who support the opposition or something like that. So you end up having we're taking in people to help them, refugees from a real war zone, and then they come to our land, and then they start fighting basically the same war that's going on in their hometowns where they're running away from. It is a little ironic and sad and scary, but that is something that could happen as a potential engulfing of this conflict if this conflict does continue to become more severe.
And that's why any and all voices that ask for de-escalation and peace and so forth, I think certainly are welcome, regardless of who they come from. I think that the bottom line is that we don't want India and Pakistan to be at war. That would not be a good thing. And
especially since they're both nuclear powered, so it could just be devastating for the entire world.
No, but for people that really haven't paid much attention or thought about it, these countries can't be underestimated as to what they're capable of doing. We'll hopefully progress through the next few weeks trying to navigate what happened. And again, it's just one further example how global politics, geopolitics can affect far-reaching countries. This would impact us. And by all means, nobody wants to see a terror attack and innocent people being hurt and killed. I think all we can do right now is hope that the governments will each do what they need to do to bring everything down a notch and to do everything in their power to prevent any further attacks. The last thing they want or need is another attack on the heels of this one. So let's keep a close eye. And
it's a little tough when the ISI, on one hand, claims to be fighting the terrorists, on the other hand, is funding and supporting them and protecting their military bases. Yeah, Pakistan is basically a collapsed country. The situation there is a complete, utter mess, both kind of internal politics and the economy, and it's just problem after problem. So basically, when countries have internal chaos, sometimes the way they'll act to unite the population, the best way is to find an external enemy, right? Many times they'll use that. So yeah, it's sad to see what's happening in Pakistan. Pakistani passports notably have a line on them that says valid for every country in the world aside from Israel. So it's a fairly anti-Semitic country just by the nature of it being a fairly religious Muslim country, but many beautiful people, beautiful culture, tradition, history. It's so wonderful. And the vast majority of the people there are very kind and good-hearted and very generous, surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly if you're familiar. But yeah, we just really hope to see an end of the hostilities and the radicalism in Pakistan specifically.
Yep, and everywhere. And it does overshadow the visit by Vice President JD Vance. However, I think we should play a little clip just to give some information and to open discussion on his visit a little further. I'm going to cue that up.
Blame Prime Minister Modi for fighting for India's industry. But we do blame American leaders of the past for failing to do the same for our workers. He is a serious leader who has thought deeply about India's future prosperity and security, not just for the rest of his time in office, but over the next century. Arguably the most popular in the democratic world, and as I told Prime Minister Modi last night, he's got approval ratings that would make me jealous.
Yeah, so Narendra Modi is definitely a highly influential and very extremely popular prime minister. He is a staunch Hindu, and he is very proud of India's Hindu culture and history. And I think that's a very beautiful thing. I'm not very familiar with Hinduism, but I know that a lot of very beautiful culture and tradition and history and a huge variety of different people types. The caste system is something that's been holding India and the Indian people back for hundreds of years, unfortunately, and that is fairly closely associated with Hinduism. But overall, very patriotic people, very kind of good-hearted people, and the people of India, the vast majority of them are very much loving of Narendra Modi. Like Vance said, he is extremely popular. And yeah, he's done a few controversial things like deleting the highest denomination bills without giving people much time to convert them, which created tremendous chaos, but also helped crack down on the kind of shadow economy that goes on there that's not taxed and stuff like that. So it helped the government actually start collecting revenue on the vast majority of the Indian economy, because until recently that was all part of the shadow economy. India has tremendous potential to replace China, and I think this is the main kind of takeaway we should have from the JD Vance meeting. Obviously, the fact that his wife is Indian and India is a superpower and the most populous country in the world, it has greatly surpassed China, who's been lying about their population numbers for a while. So it's probably they've probably passed it even further than the official kind of counts collect, the numbers that they give. But basically, Xi Jinping and China have been playing hardball with the tariff negotiations with the United States. And this is a very strong message saying, China, we don't need you. Basically, we can replace you with India, because the Chinese employee earns on average a fifth of a US employee. An Indian employee earns on average a fifth of a Chinese employee. Like we said in previous episodes, Chinese, it used to be a third world country. Now, especially when it comes to the kind of to the pay wages and stuff like that, it is no longer a third world country, and labor is much more expensive there. So there is a lot of potential in India, but anybody who's tried to do business in India before knows that it's almost impossible. India historically had some of the most strict tariffs, but also regulations, non-tariff barriers when it comes to importing goods from any country of any type. It's just extremely hard to do business in India. And this is something else that has been holding India back for a very long time, because it's hard to specialize in everything, especially even if you're a country of 1.5 billion people. Just in terms of farming, a lot of their farmers are still doing it by hand, basically, and just giving them tractors and stuff, or allowing them to reducing the regulations so that they can purchase tractors at reasonable prices can just boost the economy and the amount of food that India produces like tenfold easily. So India is a country with immense potential, and historically they had these huge trade barriers. I think that Vance coming to India is a hint to the Chinese saying, basically, if you don't come to the table, no problem, because we can sign hopefully a free trade agreement, or a very good trade agreement with India, in which they reduce a lot of the regulations on American goods, and it can hugely benefit the Indian economy and also hugely benefit the American economy. Like we've mentioned previously, with manufacturing coming back to the US, most of it will be done by kind of production line robots and pretty soon by humanoid robots. But for whatever it is that's really tricky for the humanoid robots to perfect, in the meantime, India can basically just be a vast talent pool of smart, educated, talented, hardworking people, if only the regulation can get out of the way. And I'm very hopeful that's what Narendra Modi is focusing on. Yeah, more than anything, I see this as a message to to China.
To China and other countries, all the global powers. Yep. Russia's watching. And as it unfolds over the next few months, it should be very interesting. So these other global leading powers, which when you think of large countries or powerful countries, certainly China, the very top of the list. Russia, historically, we think about Russia, certainly with regards to its military. I mean, there was actually that event that happened just recently that's been over the internet. We had actually someone, I think, from a US flagged aircraft carrier, which is the Carl Vinson, actually shared video, and then this kind of went over the internet. We can cue that up and talk a little bit about that too, as we segue into maybe other things. It's just important to understand that there's these political and power struggles that keep going on across the globe. Doesn't always make the headlines for the local news, but these things are important. Let me put that up and we can take a look at it.
Now, in the video, you see a Russian 238N Maritime Patrol Aircraft executing a very low pass-by very close to the U.S. aircraft carrier during daylight hours. It's being escorted by 2 American fighter jets, an F-35 Charlie and an FA-18 Fox, which are assigned to the Carrier Air Wing 2, which is the unit that's responsible for the interception and destruction of enemy aircraft and to establish and maintain air superiority.
And that reporting is coming by way of Kagan Dunlap. He does a lot of stuff on the internet and does an amazing job, better than most people would be able to do in explaining.
I think he's a military vet, and I think he does a lot of kind of military-related content, and yeah, he's very good.
Yeah, he knows what he's talking about. And again, it's interesting that the video was shared. There was actually another video that was going around that appeared to have been video from the Russian aircraft filming the U.S. fighter jets.
Yeah, it's remarkable. To actually see it from the opposite side, right? So we've seen these flyovers a bunch of times before. The Russians like to test U.S. military preparedness. We've seen the Chinese do close flyovers to American aircraft carriers as well. But we don't typically get to see it from the opposing side's view. And here we do. So that's a pretty great clip to watch as well.
That reminds me of a story that was recounted to me by an Air Force veteran who described his days back during the Cold War, where we were always in fear that there would be a nuclear war with Russia, or the USSR as it was at the time. And he wound up, through an interesting chain of events, winds up doing reconnaissance up in basically north of Alaska, north of Canada is where you would think. And his missions would involve flying into essentially Russian airspace or towards Russian airspace to see how fast the Russians could scramble their fighter jets to intercept. And they would basically time that to see. And the stories that he would tell me were basically that he was a young aviator and he didn't want to go and accidentally spark a war either. But his job was to get up there and then come back as soon as they saw that he was being intercepted by these Russian fighter jets. And he said he would start communicating with the other pilots, with the Russian pilots, as he would be up there. He was trying to be friendly with them because he obviously didn't want to spark anything beyond the mission that he was on. He would wave at them, they'd wave back. And then he finally was trying to find some way to have a moment with them that might be a little more connecting. And he looked down at his military rations and he saw that he had a can of Coca Cola, and he held up the can and the guy gave him a thumbs up. And he recounted that as time went on, he would have multiple encounters with would seemingly be the same opposing fighter pilot, who would ask him, put his hands up, like looking like, where's the Coca-Cola? And he would say, okay, hang on a minute. And he'd put it up. And that was a little thing that they would do between each other. And he says that thinking back, how really scary it was, and something could have gone wrong, something could have been misunderstood. Obviously, the intent of the United States wasn't to trigger a war. It was just to understand the capabilities of the adversary at the time. And Russia does that. China does that. This happens continuously. And there's a thin line when you have planes flying right near an aircraft carrier. And again, this is a super class aircraft carrier, Nimitz class, nuclear powered ship. So obviously the planes coming nearby understand that not only, and it's an aircraft carrier, so obviously they have planes that'll go up and provide cover.
And it wasn't even a fighter jet, right? It was a refueling plane or a.
And again, it's just to make a point that they can and will. But we've done the same thing historically. All these countries do, and it still is dangerous. Like anything, you're playing chicken and you want to see how far you can go. But that's just the way it is. Speaking of military superiority or egging on the adversary, I have that clip we also talked about regarding the joint operations between China Aviation Wing, their Air Force, and Egypt, of all places, which there's always been talk that they've done stuff together, but it really wasn't done in the open.
It's just a funny note on the story of the Soviet Union and Coke. So in this case, less Coca-Cola, but more Pepsi. As Gorbachev started to open up the Soviet Union to more Western companies and influence, there was just a craze about anything American, notably McDonald's and Pepsi Coke. And in terms of McDonald's, I think that the first McDonald's opening in Moscow was like this huge event with like hundreds of thousands of people and a line that lasted like days. And it was just like this remarkable experience for people who struggle to afford anything to eat, suddenly have this abundance of meat and what nowadays we would call junk food, but is very filling and nutritious, not very healthily nutritious, but at least it fills your stomach. And so that's a funny story. Another funny note is I think Gorbachev himself, or maybe the one who came right afterwards, actually participated in an advertisement for Domino's Pizza. So that's pretty funny. And maybe one episode we'll pull up that clip because it's fairly entertaining to see that the serving president of the Soviet Union or leader of the Soviet Union participated in an advert for an American company. But the most interesting thing was as the Soviet Union started opening up, millions started purchasing Pepsi Coke. But Pepsi had a problem because I think they wouldn't take rubles and they really didn't have any use for rubles. So it was like, how can we continue shipping, product, but how are we going to get paid? And this was the fall of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union is, okay, what do you want that we have? And they're like, don't you have all these old military ships you don't need and aircraft carriers you don't need? And the Soviet Union was struggling to maintain these ships and possibly aircraft and an aircraft carrier for sure. So they ended up trading it for Pepsi-Cola. So it turns out that Pepsi did more to disarm the Soviet Union than almost any military in the world did. They literally sold to Pepsi dozens of ships and other military hardware that Pepsi may have sold some of it and scrapped a bunch of it. I don't know if it was very profitable for Pepsi at the end of the day, but it's just a really funny story on that regard. Again, not Coca Cola, but similar enough. It was a great way for Pepsi to get a foothold in a brand new market, as they would look at it at least.
I'm going to tell you, something came to mind when you're bringing that up. And I'm not saying that it had an impact on bringing down the Berlin Wall and dismantling the former Soviet Republic and to what has become Russia and all the other countries. But my dad passed away quite a few years ago. Again, as we've discussed in other episodes, my parents immigrated from Portugal to Canada. And so I grew up in a household of Portuguese parents. And ultimately, they were very proud of having come to Canada, gone to Canada, and really were concerned about some of the things they were seeing happening around the world, again, with the Cold War. And after my dad's passing, I was going through his things, getting things in order, and I found a letter, which kind of, I was much younger then. I'm looking at this, wasn't quite sure what I was looking at. And it had a return receipt and it had been stamped. And it was a letter that came back stamped from the White House. And there was actually something that confirmed from the Kremlin. And I'm thinking, what in the world is this? Because I had no knowledge of it. So I opened up, there was like a copy of the letter, and there was something saying that basically the communication had been received by both the Kremlin and the White House. And I read a letter, which I wish I could, I've lost track of where that is, but the letter, the gist of the letter, as I sat there reading it, was a letter written to President Ronald Reagan and to Mikhail Gorbachev. And they basically, the letter essentially was imploring them to basically end tensions and to essentially do essentially what happened. So I'm not saying that my father was in any way to be thanked for the ultimate outcome, but it's interesting that an immigrant living in Canada, we during the Cold War, we would always think if there was ever a war to break out between the United States and the former Soviet Republic, the missiles would be flying right over Canada, and they might take a few pot shots at Canada as well. And we understood that Canada was stuck in the middle, but it was just stunning to see, and that the letter had been sent. And my dad ends the letter saying that if you don't basically come to your senses and understand the totality of what's going on, it'll be ashes to ashes and dust to dust for all of us and perhaps the planet. And I've never forgotten that. But it's not something I think about on a daily basis. But having this discussion, I recall finding that letter. And it's funny because my younger self didn't recognize the real importance of that letter. I just took it for granted. I thought it was an oddity. But today, I think that was just quite remarkable that my father would be even willing to write a letter to both leaders and just ask them to consider doing the right thing. in the end, I'm glad they did. I'm glad that the world changed for the better for all these years. And that being said, let me put up this clip with China
Yeah,
doing
just a few
maneuvers.
details while you pull that up regarding the whole Pepsi ordeal. Originally, Pepsi, because again, they couldn't use rubles, they were willing to accept Stolichnaya vodka. Many people are familiar with that. And they started selling Stolichnaya vodka in the supermarkets. But after the Soviet-Afghan war, there were US boycotted Soviet goods. So it was much harder to sell Stolichnaya vodka on kind of US shelves. And the Soviets did want to continue consuming Pepsi-Cola. So they traded 17 diesel submarines, a cruiser, a frigate, and a destroyer, roughly valuated at $3 billion. Obviously, the ships were old and obsolete, and they weren't really basically sea ready. And Pepsi sold them to a Norwegian shipyard for scrap. But yeah, it's just a fascinating story. For a time, there's a myth that basically Pepsi was the sixth largest navy in the world. Again, since most of these ships weren't really seaworthy, they weren't really a navy. Also, they didn't really have the personnel to man the ships, and obviously, etc. But yeah, just a funny story where Pepsi was kind of the sixth largest navy in the world for a very short time period.
Certainly unique. All right, let's watch this. Sometimes a show of force, perhaps, showing that China can impose itself or be present in other places. And again, it's the idea of having strategic placement of military aircraft. And China's not too shy about that. And the concern for an older person like me, who grew up understanding what the Cold War was, all these things, they all have implications. They all have risks. No one wants to misunderstand what is being done whenever there's a military maneuver or training exercise, but sometimes just the presence of military equipment in a location that could be more threatening is enough to stir things up. So it's interesting to watch as the same things of the past continue on today.
Yeah, just a few notes on the Egyptian military. First of all, it's a military that has a country. Something like a third to two-thirds of the Egyptian economy is controlled by the Egyptian military. Almost all construction is in Egypt is done by companies associated with the Egyptian military, and just they're in so many industries, IT, and just so many industries that they're a huge part of the economy. Now, traditionally, the Egyptian military was stocked by the Soviets, so they had very advanced Soviet tech, and they used that to fight multiple wars against Israel, notably losing time after time. Although Arabs never tend to admit losing a war, they always win. No matter how much they're crushed, it's still a victory if they survive to tell the tale. So they'll call it a victory, but just if you look at kind of any statistics, they lost the Sinai Desert and stuff like that, right? More soldiers dead, more equipment lost, etc. There was a point when Israel was crushing the Egyptians so badly that the Soviets started making fun of the Egyptians for being just really crappy operators of, I think it was the SA-3 back then, anti-air system, predecessors to what now is like the S-300, S-400, very advanced anti-air systems. So the Egyptians are like, okay, why don't you guys just send your professionals here? They're like, okay. This was during the war where Israel, France, and Britain attacked Egypt combined because Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal and basically stole it or took it from the French and the British. And they barred Israeli ships passing. Israel needed access, and the French and the British wanted to maintain control. So there was this war between the three nations against Egypt. So the Egyptians were struggling both against the Israelis, both anti-air capabilities and their pilots. And the Soviets would just laugh at them, saying that the Egyptian pilots are idiots and they're dumb and they're stupid and they're clueless. And how come you guys can't beat the Israelis with all the most advanced tech in the world? At the time, Israel did not receive regular weapons shipments from the United States. They did not have the most advanced weapons. So Israel was fighting with very old tech. and they were still crushing the most advanced Soviet tech. So at some point, the Soviets sent their own fighter pilots and their own operators, their own soldiers, to man these systems, and the Israelis still crushed it. And suddenly the Egyptians were like, see, we told you. It's not that we're stupid. It's the Israelis are pretty good at defending themselves. So yeah, just interesting. After the peace agreement between Sadat and Begin, the first Israel-Arab peace agreement, which was very notable, Sadat was murdered due to it, and some would say Begin was murdered due to it as well, but Sadat definitely was. And he explained that this was a Hudayba, a peace agreement, which in Islam means it's a peace agreement that isn't meant to last. It's only for 9 years, 9 months, and 9 days. And it's until you notice that your enemy is weak, and then you're just going to overthrow and kill them, like Muhammad did in Hudayba, which was a Jewish town in Arabia. The Jews there worked part of the Silk Road, so they were business people, and they would travel a lot. And with the early rise of Islam, Muhammad wanted to conquer them, but the Jews there were very rich and strong, so he knew that he couldn't conquer them. So he signed a peace agreement with them, shook hands, blood agreement, signature, everything like that. He gave his word. And remember, this is a prophet of God, according to Islam. And then the Jews were still a little suspicious at the beginning. They're like, yeah, I don't know if we can trust this Muhammad guy. But for the first year, he didn't do anything. And after a year, they had to get back to business. So they went back to the Silk Network to trade. And so 2 years in, Muhammad realized that there was nobody really there to protect the city, or obviously not much. And he brought his armies and he conquered the city, even though it was against the peace agreement he himself signed. So anytime any Arab signs or any Muslim signs a peace agreement with Jews or non-believers, typically internally to their own people, they will say this is a Hudayba agreement, which means it's an agreement meant to be breached once we're strong enough to breach it. So that's what Sadat said. It still wasn't enough to stop radicals from assassinating him. But ever since then, Egypt has basically been on the good side of the United States and has transitioned their military to receiving American armament. So now Egypt has A-1 Abraham tanks, and they have F-15 Eagles and F-16s. Actually, in this clip, I'm pretty sure we saw the J-20, which is the Chinese pretty advanced fighter jet, but we also saw an F-16, and then we saw a a Rafale, which is a pretty advanced French plane made by Dassault. Basically, we're seeing kind of Chinese tech flying together with American tech and French tech. And it's very problematic because basically you can use electronic warfare sensors to learn a lot of the vulnerabilities of this American tech. Now, yes, the F-16 is 40 years old. Thankfully, Egypt doesn't have the F-35, but it's just still, there's a lot the Chinese can gather, a lot of electronic intelligence and other forms of intel that the Chinese can gather while doing these mixed trainings together with the Egyptians. It's notable also this almost got no attention in the West, so definitely an interesting thing to bring your attention to. But yeah, historically and until very recently, the Egyptians have been arming like crazy. And when I say arming like crazy, they are arming like crazy. Like over the past maybe 10 years, they built like 30 new military ports and 50 new military Air Force bases. Egypt is in the process of moving its capital from Cairo, which is extremely overpopulated, one of the most populated cities in the world, like 80 million people live in that city, to a brand new city in the middle of the desert they're building out of nowhere. And the government offices there, and especially the military headquarters there, are like mind-bogglingly beautiful. Assisi originally, when he came to power, so he was in control of the military, and Mohammed Morsi, who was the Muslim Brotherhood leader who won the democratic elections in Egypt. So after Mubarak, who was the dictator of Egypt, fell, there was elections. And so like we saw in, let's say, in Gaza, right? If you let people in this region vote, they will probably vote for the Muslim Brotherhood. And in Gaza, they voted for Hamas, which is the Muslim Brotherhood. And in Egypt, they voted for Mohammed Morsi, who was the Muslim Brotherhood as well. And so he was ruling the country for a year. It was a complete and utter disaster, unsurprisingly. And then protests started against him. So he sent the Assisi, who was the Minister of Defense, to squash the protesters. But instead, he decided to flip sides, take the side of the protesters, and overthrow Mohammed Morsi. He's not very friendly dictator, Assisi, but he is at least fairly aligned with the West, at least before this whole Chinese training program. But at least he wasn't the Muslim Brotherhood, right? There's something beneficial to say about him, and he's considered a secular Muslim, although in Islam, secular is very different than what it means in the West. But notably, as the secular president, what he's been doing over the past 30 years, not 30 years, maybe 10 or 15 years, he's, especially in the Egyptian military, he's been building mosques like there's no tomorrow. So Egypt historically, under pan-national Arabism, was, again, a secular Arab state. And he's basically been building endless. So historically, there weren't a lot of mosques in military bases, and it was almost looked down upon if you did want to go to the mosque. And he's been building just crazy amounts of mosques in every single military base all across the country, which is turning the Egyptian soldiers much more Islamic, for whatever that's worth. Another notable thing is that Egypt has been fighting. So Egypt has a problem with the Muslim Brotherhood, and they made them illegal. Again, the one that's legal in England is illegal in Egypt, but so he was on a fight against the Muslim Brotherhood because ISIS is one of their subgroups, and ISIS in the Sinai Peninsula were very active for a very long time. The Sinai Peninsula is so Israel won that during the Yom Kippur War, and then part of the peace negotiations with Sadat, Israel offered to give it back stupidly because Sadat was apparently willing to sign the peace agreement even without that, because he was defeated so bad in their victory on the October 6th War, as they call it, which is the Yom Kippur War. But so Israel gave back the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. There are a lot of Bedouin tribes who live there. A lot of them are pretty radical Muslims, and many of them are part of the kind of ISIS. And so ISIS in the Sinai Peninsula has been extremely effective, and they were fighting the Egyptian military for a very long time, especially after Assisi made the Muslim Brotherhood illegal. And they were also busy smuggling weapons into Gaza, etc. Egypt was fighting a war against the ISIS in there for a very long time, and they basically so according to the peace agreement, there's a very strict limit to the amount of tanks and weapons and even crossings they're allowed to have into the Sinai Peninsula because it is so close to the border with Israel. And part of the peace agreement was like, okay, keep your militaries, we'll keep this areas fairly demilitarized, not completely, but mostly demilitarized. But part of the fight against ISIS, they request from Israel to allow them to send them more troops, and Israel said okay, and then they've just started amassing more and more troops all across the Sinai, with mixed results in the fight against ISIS. ISIS is weaker now than it was back then in the area. They did do a whole bunch of terror attacks, one of which was against the airport in, I think it was Taiba or somewhere there. Anyhow, now it's hard to justify why Egypt still has so many military bases, especially like secret military bases that they're building there. It does seem like they're a little bit preparing for war with Israel, even if when you look at the military ports they're building. So Egypt is a pretty decent and bitter fight with Ethiopia over the Grand Renaissance Dam, which will control part of the flow of the Nile, which is crucial for the Egyptian economy and life in Egypt. So they're very bitter. So you'd assume that if they're preparing all these new ports, maybe to potentially fight against Ethiopia, they would have the ports in the Red Sea or the Gulf of Aqaba, as opposed to having it on the Mediterranean, very close to Israel. But basically all of their military buildup seems like they're focused on Israel, which is just a worrying sign. But the last thing we need is Israel to face armies again, especially armies that have been armed by the United States for so long. So now, again, the majority of their military is F-16s and F-15s, and they've got Patriot, and they have Abrams tanks, and really the most advanced Western kit you can imagine. So it would definitely be a tough and scary war, and let's hope that doesn't happen. But their recent warm up to China and publicizing these trainings are definitely a worrisome note to me. What do you think?
Not just to Israel. Ultimately, that's something that has to be watched, and it can be concerning to the United States and globally. But I think, listen, these are things that we, on our day-to-day sort of trek through life, it's not something that we always stay focused on, but it's important once in a while to bring up that these things are going on and that they are important. And luckily we have people that are keeping close tabs on them and trying to make sure that everybody stays within their own lanes and doing the things that they should do and not get too far away from what the right thing is for the world. Because ultimately that's the challenge with a lot of these countries, is the impacts could really make a massive change to countries far and wide. But closer to home, we can think of all the things we have going on here. And with all the technology talk that we have in the military, there's a lot of exciting things happening in civilian technology, some of which has overlap into the military. But I know one of the things that we also discussed about bringing up today was just how exciting that here in cities across the United States, certainly starting in New York City, we are going to see the advent of human-sized drones transporting people.
Yeah, it's exciting and scary at the same time. Let's pull up that clip and then we'll discuss it a little further.
There's a very quick clip from Archer Aviation. They're a publicly traded company, and they make eVTOLs, which is electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. What a lot of people don't know is there's a lot of prep work being done in cities across the country, Chicago, New York, here in Miami, all the way up to Orlando. There are eVTOL launch sites where basically it's like a helipad where you'd land a helicopter, but these are being already designated far and wide. So once all the regulations catch up, the laws get signed off, we're going to be seeing more of this. Let me put this up real quick. It's a very quick clip. And there's no sound, so for those not seeing it, you could certainly go to YouTube or Rumble to take a look. Basically, it's just a quick flashing ad that shows that the JFK to New York City airport ride, which some people will actually pay, executives will pay to have a helicopter transport them so they don't get stuck in New York City, Manhattan traffic. But now you'll be able to get in this human-sized drone, which will transport you battery powered to get to your destination. And we're gonna, I think, in the next 1 to 2 years, we're gonna see more and more of this in larger cities primarily. All the large airlines have signed some sort of agreement or contract with various companies. There's a few that are doing this right now. And this isn't 10 years away or even 5 years away. I think we'll be seeing this very soon.
Yeah, in a lot of cities with dense traffic, like Mexico City or Rio de Janeiro or Argentina, et cetera, it's pretty common across Central and South America, where the ultra wealthy, instead of getting stuck in traffic, because no matter how fancy your Rolls Royce is, you're still stuck in traffic with everybody else, they'll take helicopter rides. Now, helicopters are notorious for two things: being ridiculously expensive, as well as being extremely unsafe. The reason why they're ridiculously expensive is because they're obviously very complex machines. The maintenance is very expensive, a lot of hard work. For every hour of flight, you need a lot of hours of maintenance. And then you have to pay a pilot, which is like it's a pilot, right? It's a lot of training, very expensive, and they have to be on your call and back ready to take you. And unfortunately, because of how complex it is to maintain helicopters and how unreliable they are, there are a lot of helicopter crashes, and it is a fairly dangerous kind of means of transport, even though it's convenient and cool and everything else. Now, these eVTOL drones essentially are basically just XL drones. They're drones much bigger, and then instead of putting a camera, you have a little booth for a few people. This Archer Aviation, they operate in the US, but they're probably at least 5 or 10 years behind the Chinese. The Chinese have already testing it with humans on a regular basis, probably using it. Now, these drones have a huge potential to completely replace any short-term helicopter travel because they're much safer. They typically will have at least 8 or 16 blades, rotors. So even if 1 or 2 engines are lost, there's typically enough to keep the helicopter flying. And then because you don't have to pay a human pilot, it's controlled by AI and autonomous, it basically reduces that huge cost. So you lose the cost of gasoline, the cost of maintenance, the danger involved because you have all these redundant electric motors and propellers, as well as the cost of the pilot. So drastically cheaper than helicopter rides, drastically more safe. The only issue is because they're electrically powered, they're not as useful for long range missions or for missions in remote locations and stuff like that. But these drones are going to completely replace the helicopter industry. And yeah, it's coming really fast. The issue is the regulation for the autonomous flying, but in China, regulations don't tend to be an issue when the government controls most companies. Al, who's a famous kind of ex-influencer, but a brilliant philosopher, he said, any country who does not manufacture drones will be the vassal state of a country who does manufacture drones. And this is very scary because, like we mentioned in previous episodes, if there's one technology that the Chinese are like generations ahead of any American company, and the US basically has no competition to speak of, it's in terms of drones. And these eVTOL drones, these human transport drones, are basically just extra large drones. It seems like this is an industry they're going to control as well as the traditional drone industry. And like you said, these are all dual dual use. So it could very easily be used to transport civilians and business people from JFK to downtown Manhattan, but it can also very easily be used to transport special forces or be used on a whole variety of missions, specifically non-human carrying drones. Those are extremely effective during the war. The vast majority of drones that the Ukrainians are using to fight the Russians are basically adapted civilian drones. So basically attach it to a grenade, attach to the drone a grenade launcher and a bunch of grenades, or even the warheads from like RPGs. And now this little drone can take out soldiers and can take out tanks and armored vehicles and stuff like that as well. So this is an extremely dangerous precedent. And unfortunately, there's not a single American company that makes even a remotely competitive drone, except if it's for the military industry. And even then, it's debatable because, like we've seen in Ukraine and Russia, the vast majority of the drones used in the battlefield are not military grade drones, they're civil use drones. So, yeah, as our drone pilot and specialist, what are your thoughts on the subject?
So a couple of points of interest. So the drones we're talking about are the eVTOL aircraft. They will be piloted with a pilot in the aircraft initially. So
Initially,
we know that the eventuality is going to be that there won't have to be a pilot. Either the pilots could be remote. Next phase is that they're somewhere else, just like military missions are flown where the Reaper drones and other military drones can still be piloted by someone, but you can have a pilot in a military base in the United States piloting a drone aircraft across the world. So that's number one. That might be the first phase, is to remove physically the pilot from the aircraft. Phase number two would be that it'd be completely autonomous, that there's no human interaction. But all of this is some time away, and in part because what you brought up in a previous episode, that even back when the elevator became a thing, people were reluctant to step onto a machine that was going to take them up or down and might drop and hurt them. So people were reluctant to do that, and they had operators inside the elevators initially before they became fully autonomous, as we would say. And so that's the first thing, is that we're not talking that all this technology will completely negate pilots. That's not the case. It's going to be some time out. The second thing is the safety, the redundancy, as you mentioned. I don't completely agree about helicopters not being safe. They do require maintenance. The maintenance schedules are different for rotor wing aircraft, helicopters, in other words, compared to fixed wing. I agree that a lot of fixed wing pilots would be reluctant to even step foot in a helicopter. It's just a thing. They prefer actual wings on the side of the aircraft rather than just the rotors. But all that being said, helicopters are quite safe. They can auto-rotate even if they lose power. And it's the expense and the noise, because that's the other thing. For helicopters to be flying in urbanized areas, they can be quite noisy. The flip side of it is helicopters can go quite fast, and they can also go further than we can right now with any battery powered eVTOL. And that's always been the challenge with a lot of, even for the smaller drones that are used for aerial imaging and so forth, range is always an issue. So it'll improve as our technology, battery technology improves. But it is exciting to see that we have, again, American companies. Archer is a California-based company, it's publicly traded. There are several companies that are actually doing a pretty good job in this particular space. They're not building little drones, they're building big drones, basically. Although we don't call them, that's essentially what they are. And the US is holding its own with regards to that technology. But like we were saying, sometimes it's not very visible because, much like self-driving vehicles, it's being hindered by a couple of things. Number one, making it legal, and number two, there's a concern, because there's a myriad of concerns. Self-driving car, even if the car has an accident, who's to blame? The car manufacturer, the car itself, the
car
person.
manufacturer.
It opens a can of worms. These are all questions that have to be answered. And then the same thing with all of these aircraft that are going to be basically in production very soon and more widespread. But it's happening now. And I think it's going to open up the door to really changing aviation into something that's much more futuristic. And we've always been talking about, people think of the old Jetsons cartoons and all this other stuff, but to be able to be on the freeway going somewhere in a large city and to look up and see all these eVTOL taxi services going by, it's going to happen. Interesting talk. I think this will be a topic of discussion more in depth in other episodes, but it was interesting to just talk about it and to basically point out that there's tremendous technology that's used in military aircraft and in all things military. there's a lot of spillover and there's a lot of technology that we're going to benefit from in civil aviation very soon. And I think that kind of segues into kind of just maybe taking a step back and talking a little bit about maybe some other things. Back to one of our favorite topics, politics, and how our politicians often say one thing and maybe do another, or say one thing and eventually stop doing what they're saying. You want to maybe get into that a little bit?
Yeah, but just to finish off with the drones, I'm pretty sure in China they're already testing the autonomous drones. So like you said, here we're like,
In the US and China, they're being tested here as well. So there's
yeah,
been tests.
Uber was researching it for a whole bunch of years. I don't know if they're still in. They may have exited the industry. I am a little worried that a lot of the parts and components of these advanced American manufacturers may be still manufactured in China. So if they're getting electric motors from China and the batteries from China and the electronics from China and a bunch of other components, and they're assembling it in the United States, yeah, it may seem like we're competitive with the Chinese in that industry, but doesn't necessarily mean we really are if we're not able to manufacture these things in-house. Noise is definitely an issue that the drones do not solve. The pitch is very different than a helicopter because instead of a huge rotor, it's got a whole bunch of small rotors, which tend to make it, I think, typically even higher pitch. There's a lot of research being done on the design of the propellers and the rotors and how to basically make that as quiet as possible. I do think that eVTOLs are going to take off, and they do have a future, and they're definitely going to be much more popular
You
than
hope they
helicopters.
take off and they land vertically.
Totally land, yeah. But think and like you said, in terms of kind of tech moving forwards, this definitely is, like we mentioned in previous episodes, in the past, a lot of the tech progress, at least in my lifetime, was in bits, right? Anything to do with computers and software, that's where the vast majority of tech was happening, as opposed to atoms. It seems like now, thankfully, we're changing. The tech is going to finally, the world is going to feel like the future because the tech is going to coming back to the atom world a little bit as well. That said, there are a whole bunch of different technologies now that can compete with this kind of short range transport. In terms of planes and jets, obviously supersonic jets are coming pretty soon. Boom Aviation is developing those. There's that kind of end of the market, which again, these drones don't really compete in. On the lower end, just having autonomous vehicles where you don't have to focus and you're able to do whatever you want during the drive, just immediately reduces the need for this a little bit, even if it may take you a little bit longer. If you have your time back, and instead of spending that time on driving, you're able to spend that time in whatever you like, whether that's gaming or working or eating or hanging out with friends or whatever it is. So that immediately gets rid of some of this kind of the bottom end of the market. And then if Hyperloop takes off, which is a company, when Elon was too busy with all of his other companies, he wrote a white paper about a technology called Hyperloop, which essentially is autonomous pods that travel in a vacuum sealed tube. So that way there's no air resistance. And especially using magnetic levitation, they can travel at extreme speeds and be extremely efficient, electric, and very affordable. It's currently being built and developed in a few places, but most notably the United Arab Emirates and Dubai are building a whole Hyperloop system. Because Elon was too busy, he didn't work on it on his own. It's something he could basically open source for anybody to do. And Virgin, so Richard Branson of the Virgin Group, they had a Virgin Hyperloop for a while. I think that was renamed Hyperloop One, possibly. So there's still a few companies in this industry, but that for kind of any travel is like 200 to 300 miles. Theoretically, if that takes off, it can replace all of that. So the whole eVTOL is being squeezed from both sides of the market. But yeah, we definitely will be seeing it a whole lot more in the future, and it will feel and seem like the future. The issue you mentioned of noise and sound and vibrations and just people not liking heavy things flying over their heads. Like, what if a hubcap comes spinning off? Obviously, these won't have hubcaps. The same idea. You don't want something falling over your head. The sound could be problematic, although research can hopefully help that out. So I think that this industry does have a very exciting future, and I'm very excited for us to be able to experience it for the first time. I'm not sure commercially how successful it'll be in the long run, is what I'm saying. In the short term, it will probably be fairly successful because it can replace a large majority of helicopter flights. But in the long run, yeah, it's still to be determined.
Again, this will be a topic for another episode. What you may not be aware is there's tremendous advancements being made, real limitations batteries, but tremendous advancements being made in aircraft technology. Even a simple Cessna four-seater today, you could buy it with Garmin Autoland technology, that if the one pilot passes out, the passenger can press a button and the plane will find the most appropriate airport, and that's not necessarily the closest, will communicate with the tower, will go and make adjustments as to the wind corrections and everything else, fly to the airport, successfully land the aircraft, turn the engine off, and then tell the passengers that they can deplane. The technology is way more advanced than most people realize. And there are a number of initiatives that have fixed wing and other aircraft that are battery powered already. Again, batteries are the limitation. And then the military is working very hard to have full size fighter jets that have no pilots, no human pilots on board. So there's a lot of stuff being done. And I think the message, basically, from what you're saying too, I agree, it's going to move exponentially. There's going to be a big leap forward in a very short period of time with regards to this. And the things that you're mentioning, yes, these are the things that are being worked out with regards to safety, with regards to the constraints initially when this gets more widespread. But there's been a lot of experimentation already being done in test flights, even in the United States, with regards to, and I think we have some great companies here too, basically. So that's another good thing for us. Lastly, with regards to parts supplies and so forth, this is not uniquely aviation. You could look at wind turbines. It's almost all coming out of China. And as we discussed at great length in previous podcasts and previous episodes, there's a tremendous importance to onshoring here, vital component technology, manufacturing, and so forth. So we aren't relying on other countries to be able to manufacture some of our advanced technology. So that is an important point. And I think that the current administration is very focused on making sure that's the case moving forward, so that we can come up with great ideas. But if we're relying on other countries to be able to execute and manufacture, that's certainly limiting moving forward. But
Yeah, but in terms of the plane landing, that tech, I think there's nothing revolutionary about the technology. It's just really that they were able to get authorization for it to be used. Back when autopilot was developed in like the 70s, probably, back then they tested autopilot on landing planes, and autopilot could, in the vast majority of cases, land planes many times better than the human pilots. The reason why why all passenger pilots still have humans land is because people will feel safer with a human kind of controlling the wheel as opposed to autopilot. Still, when there isn't good visibility, it is pilots are landing based on the sensor suite, so it is fairly similar to the way the autopilots would land. But this obviously is much more developed tech. But I see you're disagreeing with me, so go ahead and
I'm
give your
disagreeing with
rebuttal.
you because you're taking it out of context a little bit. It's not that we haven't had similar technology in large commercial aircraft. In fact, most people don't realize that once the wheels go up on your commercial jet that you're taking a trip to go on vacation,
It's all
basically
autopilot.
autopilot will take control of the plane, and much the flight, the almost entire flight is going to be essentially autonomously controlled. What I was trying to make a point at is that we need to basically have the capability for something that's much smaller, much less expensive. And that technology did not exist in general aviation aircraft. We just didn't have that. So if you had a small plane, even if it was $1 million aircraft, it would have autopilot, but it wouldn't go if the pilot became incapacitated and determine which airport to go to on its own.
True. Yeah.
Planes will typically go where you tell them you want to go to. If you want to go somewhere else, you have to tell the autopilot you're going somewhere else and redirecting. You have to reprogram it essentially. This is different technology. This is actually the airplane's brain essentially determining where it's going to go, how it's going to get there. It's going to make all the corrections it needs, and it's going to actually completely land the aircraft. And this is for a smaller aircraft that previously just didn't have this. The reason that's important is that's the kind of thing we want to get to in order to be able to have fully autonomous flights, be it more traditional fueled aircrafts or whether they're battery powered hybrids or whether they're eVTOLs. The bottom line is we want more and more capability to have even the smallest of aircraft being able to do everything, deal with emergencies, land, take off, and get to where they need to be. And that's been an important step forward that's been happening behind the scenes, because most people, unless they're general aviation pilots, aren't even aware that their plane's capable of doing that right now. So that's what I'm saying. There's been a lot that's happened. There's a lot of this that we've learned from. There are companies out there doing a terrific job, certainly here in the United States, at improving what the capabilities are. And I think we're about to take a big, massive leap forward. Anyone that's interested in aviation, it's an exciting time because the role of the pilot may be quite different 20 years from now. But I think for the next few years, we need pilots, and we need pilots that are interested in technology and that are going to keep up with all the things that are changing.
Yeah, I doubt in 20 years any aviation tools will require a human pilot. It may be optional. I'm not saying that human pilots will go extinct completely because new equipment takes a while until it replaces old equipment, but I doubt anything new coming out in 20 years will require human pilots. But yeah, let's go ahead and watch that Obama video you have
Yeah, that's
ready.
the first one in the series of our discussion. So this is a video from the 2008 presidential primary. You'll see Hillary Clinton was there, and who would become future President Obama was here debating. And one of the things that he's talking about has to do with the border, which has been certainly a theme for a very long time. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Administration, the Bush administration, has done nothing to control the problem that we have. We've had 5 million undocumented workers come over the borders since George Bush took office. It has become an extraordinary problem, and the reason the American people are concerned is because they are seeing their own economic position slip away. And oftentimes, employers are exploiting these undocumented workers. They're not paying the minimum wage. They're not observing worker safety laws. And so what we have to do is create a comprehensive solution to the problem. Now, I have already stated that as president, I will make sure that we finally have the kind of border security that we need. That's step number one. Step number two is to take on employers. Right now, an employer has more of a chance of getting hit by lightning than be prosecuted for hiring an undocumented worker. That has to change. They have to be held accountable.
Yeah, so I think this is pretty fascinating just because for the same word for word, if Trump says it nowadays, he's categorized as a right-wing extremist, possibly a Nazi or something like that. So it's funny to realize that this was just mainstream obvious logic until very recently. It's crazy to see how much both Obama and Hillary have aged since then. But yeah, the border used to not be a controversial issue. It was understood.
Just so you know, I've aged since then as well.
You don't look like you've aged a single day. Not that I've known you since then, but I'll stick to my guns.
Okay, I'll take it. I'll take it.
But yeah, it's funny that it's so controversial nowadays, even though the vast majority of Americans support it. The most ironic thing is where he said that they're going to prosecute employers for hiring illegals, and that should be the obvious thing, and that was what was happening for a while. And to Obama's credit, he did deport a whole bunch of illegals, actually much more than Bush did. So it's so funny how the Democratic Party basically pivoted completely. Even Barack Obama himself, where nowadays he won't say a single word negative of immigration, but back then he was very logical. So yeah, the Democratic Party has basically completely flipped on this, has done 180 degrees and become completely radical pro-immigration, pro-illegal immigration, even if that includes criminals. Elon has been pointing out a lot recently. It seems like they're importing voters, specifically because they're transporting and flying Act Blue, the nonprofit fundraiser from the Democratic causes, and a whole bunch of other kind of nonprofits. They've been caught both flying people into swing states as well as driving them or busing them into swing states. So it is just, it seems like there was a recent research that shows that if all illegals were barred from voting, then theoretically the Republicans could win another 10 seats and I guess all kind of districts were recalculated based on their population to exclude illegals. Then theoretically the Democrats would lose another 10 seats in Congress for the 27 seat deficit or something like that. So it really seems like they're doing this to stay in power. But yeah, Sarah, it was very scary and sad that this was happening. We're both very happy to see that this has been reversed and that the radical populist right-wing extremist Donald Trump is basically following Barack Obama's playbook.
As we've mentioned in other episodes, the Republican Party of today, or certainly Trump's Republican Party, as it stands, it has become much closer to old school, old time Democrat Party. A lot of the values and the things that they were saying, clearly, just like from this video, were the same or pretty close to the same. And it only makes sense because ultimately, why was that being said by former President Obama? It's because he knew that the audience, which was a Democratic audience for a Democratic primary, but also any independents or Republicans listening in on the primary would want that. Just anyone else would want it. You don't want to just open the doors and let people come into the country without some proper documentation and some proper permission. And that was okay to say then. And as we saw, that sort of deteriorated dramatically, certainly within the last previous administration. But it's interesting, I think in politics, there's always this concern that politicians will say what they want to say and not necessarily follow suit. As you said, yes, indeed, President Obama was actually very serious about deportations. He deported and basically made sure that there was a strong enough presence to be able to apprehend individuals who are in the country illegally. But that kind of eventually went away. And it's no different than just about all the other things that we see in politics where the politicians are. We have this clip with Bernie Sanders and Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, getting off a private jet. Hang on, I think let me put that up. They're going around, they're Democratic socialists, basically socialists, and they're going around just screaming from the mountaintops about climate change and how they have to protect the environment and reduce carbon emissions. And here we go. There's no audio on this one, so we can describe what we're seeing. There's a beautiful jet right there, and then we're gonna be seeing AOC and Bernie Sanders coming off the jet, and then some other people and staff, just like a lot of celebrities and a lot of other people who say one thing and maybe just do the other, or they say they're super important and too busy to save time and to continue to save the world. They need to be able to have their private jet, but we can't have ours.
Yeah, and this kind of relates to the next clip you have as well. I think it's just ironic how they claim billionaire bad, billionaires evil, billionaires horrible, billionaires are stealing your money. So first of all, it's ironic because historically Bernie used to say the exact same thing, just with a slight change. Instead of B, he used to say M, millionaires bad, millionaires evil, millionaires taking your money, until he became a multi-millionaire. We won't ask how, but surprisingly, he owns 4 houses and is worth like $12 million or something like that.
Isn't socialism great?
Yeah, it's very
I
effective
don't
at
know of
making
any
you
real
richer, bro.
socialists who actually have that. Yeah, at the top, in the socialistic run government or country, the people at the very top have all the nice things, and everyone else has very little. Maybe a
Yeah.
little bit of rice or corn or something to eat. Maybe.
Yeah, so it's just very duplicitous, where they're so busy yelling against the evil billionaires, and then flying in a private jet is something that is basically exclusive for billionaires. So Bernie changed his tone, like we said, from millionaire to billionaire once he became a millionaire. But so suddenly the enemies are billionaires. Just wait until Bernie becomes a billionaire, and then it'll be the deca billionaires, which are like the people worth 100 billion or more. But basically, is the richer that he and AOC become, the higher the criticism level goes. But most of their fans haven't noticed. But also, they care so much about the environment. Basically, flying on this compared to flying in a regular jet is 100,000 times more damaging to the environment. And again, if you're an important business person, you've got to travel and your sleep is important. I get it, right? But these people are doing it for political events. They're flying to give speeches about how bad the economy is and how horrible Trump is. Sorry, how bad the environment is and how Trump is destroying the environment, and we as a whole are destroying the environment, and how evil all the billionaires are. But they're basically acting very much like a billionaire while flying out to rally against billionaires, and extremely polluting the environment while flying out to tell everybody to watch out for those plastic straws and take care of the environment. So
Do you think there's a chance that maybe they actually don't believe what they say? For example, President Obama also spoke about rising tides but he bought a house on Martha's Vineyard. He's right by the water. No one seems to be too scared for their mansions being too close to the water. So you wonder, they like saying certain things. You mentioned the straws. I think we have a clip about straws and plastic, and that might be a good time to play that.
this is a great clip too.
Hold on
It's
a minute.
very funny.
All right, yeah, here it is. Let me put that up. Let's listen to this.
You want to end all plastic manufacturing?
I said the plastics industry must be stopped.
So does that mean in plastic manufacturing?
In my dream world, sure, but I think that, go ahead.
No, so I don't mean to be condescending here. I just point out, what's going to replace your glasses? Like,
So I
would you wear
do
your
know,
glasses around your face? They're made of plastic.
maybe.
No,
I don't know what they're made out of.
They are. What
So-
about, and I'll just point out some things here, because I just want to be realistic when we're having conversations, because when statements are made like this, I just want to open people's eyes and say, okay, that's easy to say, but what's the solution? Your water bottle in front of you.
This one?
Yes. That plastic?
No.
The lid is. That's plastic.
So
Right.
I would say to your
cell phone-
question that I would first be concerned about single-use plastics, and then we can talk about alternatives to this.
Your cell phone there. Is it plastic?
The cases, but it's glass because I broke
Oh, the components
this
inside of it's
screen
not
yesterday.
plastic? The components made out of it's not in plastic? Yeah, they are. The water that you filled that water bottle up with, where'd you fill that water bottle up out of?
A water filling station.
All right, and it was delivered by a drink station that was plastic?
I didn't check.
The edges are. The piping coming to it. Now, you have a couple of choices with the piping. We could go back to using wood, but then you have to have line it in chemical. Or we could go back and use lead, because we used to have water piping that was lead. That was harmful to us. We go back to galvanized, but galvanized rust and had discoloration. And we go back to copper, but copper has to be mined, and everybody wants to stop mining in the U.S. So you use plastic to deliver piping that you fill that water bottle up with today. I point this out because the clothes you have on, I guarantee have plastic in it. The shoes you have on your feet, the soles of those shoes are plastic. So we talk about any plastic manufacturing, and everybody in here cheers when you say that, but everybody here is depending on plastic as you set. So if you want to end it, then quit using it. It's kind of like, I don't shop at certain places right now because I don't agree with some of their policies. I choose not to do that. You can choose to not use plastic. Do your work. If you believe it, then live it that way.
Yeah, this is a great clip.
And it points out the obvious when you are such an advocate for something, but you're not really living the something.
Even more, you're completely oblivious to its ramifications, right? So you're like campaigning for something and you're just completely oblivious to what that actually means in reality. I love the environment, and I think you do too, and so does Elon, right? And a bunch of times Elon was asked, if you can end oil usage right away, would you do that? And he was like, no. They're like, what? Especially back when he was conceived of as this environmentalist. They were like, aren't you like all for the environment? He's like, yeah, but I'm also for like human life and civilization and continuity. If we just stop using fossil fuels, the world will come to a halt, right? So what we need to do is find solutions that are much better for the environment, and critically, they can't just be better for the environment. They also have to be a better product overall. The cardboard straws, as an example, it's complete shit when it's a paper straw and you can't drink out of it post 3 minutes, right? So finding a solution that's a horrible solution is not going to cut it, right? We have to find replacements that are better, not just for the environment, but have a better overall user experience and are competitive, price competitive, right? So they have to be cheaper than plastics. And that's very hard because virgin plastics is extremely cheap. So plastic is so useful. It's so usable. It's extremely unhealthy, and microplastics get into our food and into our drinks and into our bodies through the fish that we eat and through everything that we drink and everything that we consume, and probably through our skin, polyester, nylon clothes and stuff like that. Even rubber nowadays is mostly made out of oil derivatives, not actually out of natural rubber. So I think the objective is a very noble one, but you have to understand that just say ban plastics is a ridiculous claim. Just like ban oils is a ridiculous claim. What you have to do is take the Tesla route, build a car that will beat regular cars on basically everything that matters, right? So even the original Model S, it was a luxury sedan that can comfortably fit 5 people with a huge trunk and a big frunk, but it was off the line faster than most Ferraris at the time. And it was great for the environment, and it had decent range, and it was competitively priced, right? So you have to basically accomplish all of those in order to start changing the world. And that's what Elon understands, but all these environmentalists and activists, they don't understand, and they do not want to understand.
No, it's all true. And I think that the concern isn't that, I think most people want to get to the same place. It's just how you get there. And that sometimes by thinking you can magically change everything overnight actually causes more problems and causes further delays. And I think, unfortunately, that's what we often find when politicians are lobbied to approve certain changes and do certain things without really understanding. Just like we have activists who may not understand all the ramifications. The politicians often don't either, and they're the ones signing things into law. They may even be well intended, but ultimately we often have to take a step back. And we have to look at what's happening closer to home. We're worried about saving the planet and all these other things, and I think that those are, again, very noble and I think very important. But the day-to-day life in our cities and counties are just very important as well. We can't ignore those things. We have so much going on that needs to be attended to. We were talking about that situation in New York City where there's these patrols that are going on. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, it's crazy. So I spent about a year living in New York City in a Jewish community there. And there were, even back then, before anti-Semitism reared its ugly head like nowadays, there were a decent amount of anti-Semitic attacks. So the Jewish community had like a local patrol. They weren't armed, and they couldn't arrest anybody aside from like a citizen arrest until the police came. But they would coordinate very closely with NYPD and work very closely with them. And they would patrol the streets, and they would catch thieves and criminals and people who would just attack a Jewish teenage boy on his way to synagogue on a Saturday or something. Basically a rapid response team, and they would be able to just get out there because they're local and they know everybody and everything, and just apprehend the person until the police arrive. And yeah, they weren't allowed to use violence or intimidation or anything. They're not armed or anything like that. But the Jewish community has been attacked for a very long time. There are other communities in New York who claim to be attacked but aren't actually attacked, notably because most of the attackers tend to come from within that community many times. And that's where it's surprising. So the fact that there is like a community patrol isn't necessarily out of the ordinary. It's the type of patrol that it is and the intimidation that it can cause. Let's watch the clip, and I think we'll.
Yep. Let me get it up here. This is brought to us from One American News. Here we go.
They're alarmed after seeing Muslim community patrols driving through their neighborhoods in what looked like police squad cars. One America's Pearson Sharp has the details.
New Yorkers say they're shocked after seeing Muslim patrol cars roaming their neighborhoods like police squads. These Muslim community patrols just began operating in Brooklyn this year, with members dressed like police officers and driving cars identical to police squad cars. Even other Muslims have raised questions about the need for the patrols, with residents expressing fears this is just another form of Sharia law enforcement area. Others denounce residents for drinking, claiming this is a Muslim area and alcohol is not permitted.
So I think that's the real fear here. Just looking at that cop that they used in the image with his long beard, very reminiscent of ISIS police when ISIS originally were very successful and started conquering a large swath of Iraq and Syria. They set up their own internal police force. And although the uniform and the cars looked different because these look identical to NYPD, the kind of the way that the cop was standing with his long beard and basically there to enforce Sharia law was very reminiscent of kind of ISIS land when ISIS was actually in control of territory before Trump got rid of them in his last administration. So yeah, a little scary. These can be used to intimidate non-Muslims, and like we saw, even Muslims into Sharia law, into not drinking alcohol. They're basically coming here, and then instead of accepting American values, they're trying to enforce Islamic values onto America. And that's what's very scary to me, especially happening in New York City.
The idea of there being patrols, safe security or safety patrols, I wouldn't be really alarmed by that. What is, I think, striking is that it says MCP right on the hood of the cars, Muslim Community Patrol, MCP. They have blue lights like a police car. The cars are painted up to look very much like a police car. The uniforms can be confused as a police officer uniform.
And the logo looks identical to the NYPD logo, especially the one on the car.
Right. So it seems quite, I would think if people saw cars that said Christian Community Patrol, they would question that too. It's not because it's
All hell would break loose. It would be on every headline of every newspaper.
Protestant Community Patrol. Fill in the blank. It just seems, it certainly seems unusual, but I guess it's not that unusual when we think that not long ago, the CCP was accused of having Chinese security forces, police, whatever you want to call them, in Canada and the United States, setting up their little police departments essentially on US soil, which again, they may have not really been legitimately police officers, but that certainly got a pushback as well. So it's not that people are focusing only on this one particular group, but the bottom line is we already have police departments, multiple layers of policing. Do we really need another additional layer? And it's fine if a neighborhood has security forces to basically alert the police to a problem, to be able to be like a community watch. I think that's terrific. But it just does give the impression that this might be something well beyond that. So it just makes you wonder. And then a lot of other things in and around New York City as well have come into question in other large cities, one of which had to do with even education and how anti-Semitism seems to be baked into some of the education that's going on. We have that clip from Senator John Kennedy from Louisiana. I think that would be a good one to pull up next.
Yeah, I think while you're pulling that up, just to touch on your point, like we saw with the Chinese secret police stations, it isn't necessarily always to influence just the random people around. The reason why we accept Americans into Chinese into America is because we want them to assimilate and to become Americans. And many Chinese Americans have assimilated in beautiful ways. So what China was realizing is, oh no, this is a problem, because if they're assimilating into the United States, it will no longer be loyal to the Chinese Communist Party. So they set up these secret police that can harass and torture and kidnap and scare people. And a lot of these secret police, they had like consulate passes. They can't be pulled over by the police, and
Like they have immunity.
Immunity, exactly. So, but they can be extremely effective at scaring Chinese Americans into being good subjects of the Chinese Communist Party, which many times includes spying on American companies and American businesses and American people for the Chinese Communist Party. Similarly, we're seeing this like where this radical Islam is setting up these patrols, not necessarily to harass Christians trying to have a beer, although it seems like that's happening too, but even more noticeably, or at least their first priority, is to harass Muslims into being quote unquote good Muslims, which means following Sharia law closely. And that is something scary, because we do not want America to turn into another London stan. And this seems like it's what is happening in New York. But let's go ahead and watch Mr. Kennedy, because this is fascinating.
All right, let's listen in.
What's in this toolkit? This Stop Gaza Genocide Toolkit. It contains the biggest bunch of anti-Semitic rot you can imagine. The toolkit, among other things, it breaks down how to mobilize pro-Palestinian campaigns on social media. It tells our students and our teachers how to boycott and encourage divestment from pro-Israel organizations. It encourages readers to print out Palestine yard signs and calls our kids and our parents to action. Now, the head of the public schools in New York was embarrassed once people started going, what's going on?
This is fascinating. Again, if a specific teacher or a specific school wants to indoctrinate children to hating Israel, which is what this is, it's not about stopping any genocide in Gaza. It's about indoctrinating children to hate Israel. That's one thing. Some would say it's their derivative, but not if it's a publicly funded school with public money in the city with the most Jews in the world outside of Israel. And again, we've seen anywhere where these pro-Palestine, which really just means pro-jihadi terrorism, protesters happen, anti-Semitic attacks just skyrocket there, right? So indoctrinating people into this is causing just tremendous amounts of anti-Semitism. And the question is, why is this happening in New York City? Why are children being indoctrinated into politics in the first place, especially into these radical ideas and opinions? And it's one thing convincing children to support a genocidal regime or idea, which, at least in my opinion, Palestinianism, not the Palestinian people necessarily, but the idea of creating a Palestinian state to replace the Jewish state, not to live next to a Jewish state. That is never the objective of any of the Palestinians. It is always to replace the Jewish state. And someone will say, oh, in Camp David, Yasser Arafat agreed. And if you look at it, first of all, he right away said, this is to his people, this is a Hudaybiya agreement. Don't assassinate me like you guys did to Sadat. But even then, the indoctrination to terror, and again, the Palestinian Authority funds terrorism and stuff like that. And even then, he basically said, we're fine with a two-state solution. And everybody's like, perfect, two-state solution. This is what everybody wants. But then when you look at what he actually said, especially internally in Arabic, is he said, we want a Palestinian state. Okay, no problem. The Palestinian state will be Judenrein, completely clean of Jews. Not a single Jew will live in the Palestinian territories or states. And that's true now, that in areas controlled by the Palestinian Authority, Jews are not allowed to live whatsoever. So aside from the fact that everything to do with that, he basically said, we'll have one side that's a Palestinian state, and the other side will have the right of return, and we'll get to that in one moment, and then it'll be a democratic state. So it's important to understand the right of return. Refugees happen from everywhere in the world. Typically, refugees are handled by UNHCR, the Human Rights Commission, right? Something like that. They're in charge of settling refugees. Many times they'll create short-term settlement projects to help settle the refugees. And the idea is to get the refugees citizenship and let them settle so they can start a new life. That's the objective. It's not to force them back into the country where they were expelled from. During the late 1940s, at the same time Israel was created and this Nakba happened that we discussed earlier, the quote-unquote catastrophe, where somewhere between 400 and 800,000 Arabs left the land of Israel. Many of them left because they were told by the Arab leaders saying, hey, we're coming to annihilate this Jewish state with 7 armies with the most advanced Soviet tech. We're going to crush them, because at the time the Israelis didn't even have an air force, didn't even have an army, really. They were a brand new state. They had literally just declared independence. So we're going to eradicate them. We're going to kill all the Jews, or we're going to force them into the ocean, which means kill them, or at least kick them out. And then you'll come back and basically you'll have your house and also your Jewish neighbor's house. Don't you like that? They're like, okay, sure. So just leave, get out of the way. We can more easily conquer Israel. So many of the 400 to 800,000 Arabs that left then were actually left because of the advice of other Arabs and not because the Israelis forced them out. But again, regardless, it's considered the Nakba and stuff like that. So the UN created UNRWA to handle the Palestinian refugees. And at the very exact same time, it was right after the Korean War, they created UNCRA to handle the Korean refugees. And UNCRA had like 1/5 of the budget of UNRWA, that initial budget. And they were able to resettle like 3 million people within 3 years, got it all done, taken care of, no problem. UNRWA was attacked and bombed by the Palestinian people initially, until all of the foreign observers and foreign volunteers basically were afraid and ran away. And then the Arab countries pressured the UN to keep UNRWA, but to change the rules where Palestinian refugees will not be settled. The objective is not for them to be settled, unlike every single other refugee group in the entire world. And during that time, just between India and Pakistan, there were tens of millions of refugees. Between Russia and Germany, there were millions of refugees. So refugees right after World War II were moving from place to place all over the world in the millions, right? The only ones who got this special status are the Palestinians, who received the status of perpetual refugees. So typically the refugee is just the person who was kicked out, and just for the time period until they receive residency somewhere else, except the Palestinians. Palestinian quote-unquote refugees are refugees for their entire life, even if they're resettled in another country, even if they receive citizenship and they have a job and the kids go to school, etc. And not just that, their kids are forever refugees, and their grandkids and their great-grandkids, which is how the quote-unquote number of Palestinians from those initial 400 to 800,000 that either voluntarily left or were forced out of Israel during the creation of the state and the wars when 7 countries attacked the tiny little country, that's how those 400,000 people are now counted as like 16 million refugees. So when Yasser Arafat says, all we want is a Palestinian state and then a democratic state after the right of return, they're saying first Israel has to take back 16 million quote unquote Palestinian refugees. That's what the right of return means, that these people have a right to return to their home, not to the Palestinian side. No, they have to return to the Israeli side. Then once the Palestinians are a vast majority, because right now there are already about 2 million Israeli Arabs. Those are Arabs that have full rights in Israel. They work as judges and doctors and nurses and everything else in the US government, in the Israeli government, politicians and everything else. So aside from those 2 million, there are roughly about another 2 million people, Arabs in Judea and Samaria, which is known as the West Bank. And then there were, at least prior to the war, roughly 2 million in Gaza. A lot of these numbers are exaggerations and lies. They haven't had serious census in a very long time. And many of these people have left. So there's a chance that these numbers are like half of what they're stated. But regardless, if you count all of that together, because those people also have a right of return into Israel. So even the Palestinians in Palestine have a right of return to Israel. So you're talking about like 6 million plus another 15 million. So now a country that's now 10 million people, of which 8 million are Jews, would be a country of extremely dense 23 million, of which like 17 million are Arabs. And then he's fine with democratic elections, right? Which obviously means the majority wins and there's no more Jewish state. And then just like we saw on October 7th, just like we saw, you can say, oh, October 7th is because of all the evil things the state of Israel has done and the blockade, et cetera, et cetera. But if you look at the 1930s, before the state of Israel was declared, before anything like that, there were regular anti-Semitic attacks and riots against Jews where Jews were massacred October 7th style on a regular basis. This happened in Hebron and in a bunch of cities and towns on such a regular basis that the Jews had to create these militia forces to defend themselves that later turned into the IDF. But yeah, like basically on a regular basis, October 7th style attacks were happening before Israel was created. So it's not about 2 states. It's not about what Israel did or the fact that there are settlements. Everybody says, oh, it's because of the settlements. It has nothing to do with the settlements. Before there were settlements, before there was an Israel state, from the moment there were Jews there, the Jews were attacked by Arabs. And again, Jews had been there ever since the Second Temple was destroyed, small communities of Jews, but they were under Ottoman law. So they were considered dhimmis. They have to pay a super high tax and be disrespected and basically second-class citizens because only Muslims, according to Islam, have equal rights or have any rights really. And then anybody who's not a Muslim has very much second-rate citizens. And the idea is that you have to pay super high taxes and be disrespected until they're willing to convert to Islam. Jews have lived in those situations for a very long time, but as we saw kind of Zionism wake up and Jews move to Israel, and then in many times in response to the financial opportunities that the Jews created and some of the Templars as well, Christian Germans created in Israel, huge amounts of local Arabs flocked from different areas. So it's funny because all these Palestinians are Palestinians for 1,000 generations, but then when you look at their last name, it's like Al-Misri, which means from Egypt, or Al-Halabi, which means from Halab, which is a part of Syria. So a lot of these Palestinian families and heritages, these are families that came for the financial opportunities that started after Zionism came. But even in those early days, even before the state of Israel was founded, even when there were in general fairly close relationships between the local Jews and the local Arabs, massacres of Jews were a regular occurrence. So basically inciting this in New York to New York school children is just a little bit disturbing, at least to me. What do you think?
Of course, it should be disturbing to anyone. No one should incite hate of any group of people, and definitely anti-Semitism is not to be accepted. But even worse, it's being indoctrinated in the New York City school system, the largest school system, I think, in the country. And just for those that maybe are joining us that hadn't been with us on prior episodes, obviously you've lived in Israel. You're not just spouting stories, you're telling the truth and what your experience was. You have family that lives in Israel. And just again, for everyone that maybe doesn't understand, you mentioned, of course, that it's not just Jewish people that are living in Israel. There's Arabs, there's Muslims who live in Israel that are Israeli citizens. And you mentioned some of the types of work that they do. They could be judges, they could be politicians, they could be nurses, or driving a bus, you name it. But let me ask you a question just so that everyone hears the answer. Are there any non-Jewish people that are Israelis in the Israeli Defense Forces, in the military?
Sure, I served with a whole bunch of both Christian Arabs and Muslim Arabs and Druze and Bedouins. They're remarkable people, and many of them are very Zionistic. And that's the thing. Everybody's, oh, you have to be Jewish to be a Zionist. Winston Churchill was a Zionist. He definitely wasn't Jewish. But yeah, there are a lot of, actually, one of the most notable spokespeople for the state of Israel, not in an official capacity, is an awesome young dude named Yosef Haddad. And he is an Israeli Arab who speaks fluent Arabic, and he will go on to BBC Arabic, which is pretty radical, unfortunately. You'd assume it's BBC, but it's more Al Jazeera than BBC. And he will debate them and argue with them in their language, in their face. And so some of Israel's staunchest defenders, even Israelis, are Israeli Arabs. It's obviously much less common. Honor killings are a thing in the Arab communities, even within Israel. And there is nothing more shameful, quote unquote, to your family and to your tribe than to support the Israeli state. But still, it happens. Yeah, there are a whole bunch of Arabs in the IDF, including Muslim Arabs.
Sure. And I knew the answer to the question, but I asked the question because if you listen to some of the legacy media, you'd be given the impression that Israel is closed off to anyone who's not Jewish, and it's very, very exclusive. And it's not like that at all. In fact, during the October 7th massacre, there's no better way to call that terrorist attack, there were obviously individuals who were taken captive who weren't Jewish. It's just insane. I mean, that the
including
narrative,
Muslim Arabs.
yeah, Muslim Arabs who were attacked in the same way, who were taken captive. And it's just odd how the media often doesn't portray the whole truth. They portray a small piece of the truth, but not the whole truth. And ultimately, this idea of people going to live in a country, of course, there are Zionists who may not be Jewish. That's their country. They're Israeli. No different than us living here in the United States or someone living in Japan. You're going to be proud of your country. You're going to be, even if you didn't, maybe you might have had an ancestor that lived somewhere else at some point. But ultimately, the character of the country, a country is based on the people living there and really what they believe in. We believe in what makes America great, what makes America unique and different. There are some people, unfortunately, live in this country that don't view the country as being so great or being so maybe different in a positive way. Luckily, most Americans do. Most Americans are fighting to make the country even better. And most people in the world want to come to the United States. But the reality is, as you've mentioned, even during this episode, that when you go somewhere, you'd want to become like the people there. If I moved to Japan, I wouldn't want to make Japan United States. I'd want it to stay Japan, and I would endeavor to become the best at living in Japan as possible, especially if I decided that that's where I wanted to live out my life, or you can fill in the blank with any other country. And actually, there's one of the things we were talking about earlier. Remember, we had an individual talking about how he had ancestry grandparents who basically have a unique situation where, because of his grandparents and his parents, he's both Pakistani and Indian. And we were bringing that up earlier in the episode regarding the terror attack in India, and that those two countries have not always seen eye to eye. And he made a plea for how there should be peace and how people should learn to live together in harmony. And yet, the clip I want to put up next is the one we talked about earlier, we alluded to, where a couple of years ago, and this, again, he was an elected official in Scotland, and he went on this rant for a while. I think we have a minute clip of that, where he seemed upset that there were too many white people, not enough Muslims or what have you in Scotland. And it's just, if I went to Portugal, I'd expect to find Portuguese people there. If I went to Taiwan, I would imagine there'd be mostly majority Taiwanese. I wouldn't be upset if I was in the minority going there, because that's just the way it is. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, and while you're pulling that up, I think one of the things that makes the United States so special and so unique is that the fact that it's a melting pot of people, right? And people come from even New York City, right? Like we were mentioning earlier, basically there are people from every single nationality, every country, every territory in the world that live in New York City. And that's part of the beauty of New York City, right? It's so vibrant, it's so alive, there are so many cultures and they're all mixing. What happens is when one culture comes and wants to be dominant over others, even when they're the guest, essentially, right? People don't realize, it's funny, a lot of pro-Palestinian claims are that Israel is an occupier. It's basically it's a European colonizer state, right? And that all these Europeans are trying to control the Arabs, and it's essentially just a continuation of colonization. And Israel is the last kind of bastion of a colonizing state, when in reality, Israel is a melting pot more than most other countries, specifically because in the same 1948, in that same time period where the same 400 to 800,000 Palestinians were convinced / forced to leave their homes in Israel, at the very same time, the Arab League passed a whole bunch of rules that made it really tough for any Arabs living in Arab countries. And historically, although categorized as dhimmis and second-class citizens, millions of Jews lived in Arab countries, in everywhere from Iran to Iraq. The Jewish community in Iraq was there ever since the destruction of the first temple, so of Solomon, right? And Jews have stayed there. And in Afghanistan, there was a Jewish community, and then Yemen and Morocco, Tunisia, kind of Libya. So what happened was, around 1948, when Israel was formed, is that most of these countries forcefully or forced the Jews to leave, right? And there were millions of Jewish refugees. Worth noting that the UN didn't create any agency for the Jewish refugees, none whatsoever. Israel accepted them all and resettled them all. But so Israel is this country of refugees from all over. So you have the local Jews who have been in Israel for thousands of years, literally, little communities that have been there for thousands of years. And then you'll have all of these. So the most dominant Jewish community in Israel currently is the Moroccan community. They're most dominant both number-wise, but also culture and food. Moroccan food is extremely common in Israel, and so is Tunisian and other food styles, Persian food, Iraqi food. So you have this melting pot. You have Jews from India, and you have Jews from, like we mentioned in a previous episode, there were Jews who during the First World War ran away and were living in China. So you have these communities from all over the world who mix, of course, all the European Jews that were left after World War II. Jews come from the US and from Canada. So really from every country in the world, Israel is a melting pot of cultures, of traditions, of people. So when people try and say Israel is a colonizer state, European colonizers trying to colonize Arab lands, it's complete bullshit, because the vast majority, so over 50% of current Israelis come from Arab countries. So most Israelis are from, their heritage is from the Middle East, right? So the vast majority of Israelis are Middle Eastern. Obviously, close to 50 or something like 45% are Ashkenazi Jews, which are European Jews. But you have this beautiful kind of intermixing of people from all cultures, all backgrounds, all traditions, including different religious backgrounds. There are hundreds of thousands of Christians in Israel as well, both Arab Christians we mentioned as well, but also after the fall of the Soviet Union, a whole bunch of Christians came. During the Vietnam War, Israel accepted a bunch of Vietnamese refugees, and many of them married and stayed in Israel. During the Lebanese Civil War, a whole bunch of the southern Lebanese military and a whole bunch of Lebanese Christians came to Israel because they partnered with Israelis, and then when Israel withdrew, their families would be completely annihilated and massacred. So Israel brought them in and accepted them. So Israel really is this melting pot of notably Jews from all over the world, but not just Jews, people from all over the world. The Vietnamese who settled in Israel were not Jews, and the Sudanese we mentioned earlier in the episode are not Jews either, and Israel just accepted them like 10 years ago. Israel is this phenomenal melting pot of peoples from all cultures, all traditions, all backgrounds, and that is what makes Israel special, just as it is what makes the United States special.
All right, got that video. And this is via the Roma Invicta channel. This is actually from a couple of years back. Let's play it.
That 99% of the meetings I go to, I'm the only non-white person in the room. But why are we so surprised when the most senior positions in Scotland are filled almost exclusively by those who are white? Take my portfolio alone. The Lord President, white. The Lord Justice Clerk, white. Every High Court judge, white. The Lord Advocate, white. The Solicitor General, white. The Chief Constable, white. Every Deputy Chief Constable, white. Every Assistant Chief Constable, white. The Head of the Law Society, white. The Head of the Faculty of Advocates, white. every prison governor white. And not just justice, the chief medical officer white, the chief nursing officer white, the chief veterinary officer white, the chief social work advisor white. Almost every trade union in this country headed by people who are white. In the Scottish Government, every Director General is white. Every chair of every public body is white. That is not good enough.
Yeah, and the reason why this is so ridiculous is because you, Mr. Hamza Youssef, are in fucking Scotland. Of course everybody's white. Like you said, if you go to Portugal, you anticipate everybody there will be Portuguese. If you go to Iraq, all politicians are Arabs, right? If you go to Yemen, most of them are Yemenis and Arabs too. So it's if you go to Iran, most of them are Persian, even though there are lots of very large minorities in Iran. It's just a ridiculous claim. This was during the culture war, where the fact that you said the word white was basically a derogatory term, right? This was meant to offend people. And it's like you, an immigrant, were able, because of the Western values that Scotland has, you were able to work your way up through the entire political system to become the prime minister of the entire country, the first minister of the entire country, right? And then you stand there and you complain that there aren't enough Muslims in other positions. And yes, he's saying everybody else is white, but you know, at least what I read between the lines is there should be more Muslims, which, like we see now, Scotland does have a problem with a whole bunch of Muslim immigrants who do not fit with the society there in Muslim. And I know we don't have that clip now, but we recently saw a clip of Conor McGregor on Tucker Carlson where he said, this is Ireland, not Scotland, but still, this is an invasion of the country, right? You're bringing in millions of people who have a birth rate 10 times higher. You're incentivizing their birth rate, and they are changing what makes Ireland, right? They are changing the culture. They're changing the people. They're changing what's dominant. You're basically committing genocide against the Irish people, right? So what Hamza Youssef, the Prime Minister of Scotland, is standing there in Parliament and saying, we need more genocide of the Scottish people. This is wrong. This is bad that Scottish people are in charge of Scotland. And again, most countries are not a melting pot like the United States or Israel, right? Most countries are nothing like that. In the Palestinian territories, Jews are not allowed to live, let alone have any professional license or get a job or be in the political assembly, right? Same in Saudi Arabia. Anybody who's not a Muslim is not allowed to enter the city of Mecca. You can't even go past the gates of the city. On the highway, you're not allowed to enter the city of Mecca. And if you do, in Saudi Arabia, they tend to hang people on a very regular basis. So it's like, how dare you, right? Go back to Pakistan and complain why there aren't enough white people in the assembly there. But you're standing in Scotland as the first minister, as basically the prime minister, complaining that there aren't enough Muslims. It's just ridiculous when Scotland has done a tremendous amount to bring in Muslim refugees and refugees from all over the world. It just feels duplicitous to me.
It is. And again, when you have someone, and again, he's making a point, but it's a point that needs to have a huge asterisk and a disclaimer along with it, which is just a common sense explanation that we're giving. And clearly it would seem that he's somewhat privileged given that he was able to rise to the level that he's at, and maybe he needs to be working harder to help other people who want to do the same regardless of what their national origin was or is. And that brings up this other question that we touched upon when preparing for the episode, and that has to do with a topic that keeps rearing its head, and there's a lot of, let's just say, the furor in the discussions at times, and this has to do with birthright citizenship. And there's an interesting clip I think we would like to share with our audience that gives certainly one point of view, and I agree with it. I don't think that the intent of allowing individuals to become U.S. citizens was to encourage everybody and their extended families to come over just for the purposes of giving birth here in the United States, to then make them citizens and then allow the other rest of the family to qualify for status. That wasn't, I believe, the intent either. Let me play that. We can then put our 2 cents in.
Birthright citizenship is the biggest, costliest scam in financial history. An illegal alien can come here 9 months pregnant or on a tourist visa, 9 months pregnant, have a baby. That baby is then declared an automatic citizen, which then entitles the entire family to come here and live here, and every one of them can get welfare. Yes, they can get unlimited welfare, applying as the custodian of this citizen child. The biggest financial ripoff of Americans in history, not to mention the fact that it is the #1 magnet for illegal immigration and invasion, and that is used by foreign governments to conduct espionage against the United States. Because now, see, we can keep out a foreign spy who has a visa, who's trying to get permission to board an airplane. But what happens when a foreign government uses this ridiculous birthright scam in order to create automatic citizens who then grow up as assets of a foreign government? So it's a major national security threat. The 14th Amendment, the provisions in question were ratified for the children of freed slaves. You can go read the minutes of the debate. They were talking about the children of freed slaves after the Civil War.
Yeah, no, you're 100%
The idea
right.
that this was meant to provide illegal alien children with automatic citizenship. Do you really think that in the 19th century, 3/4 of states all got together to pass an amendment to say that people that Congress has forbidden from entering here can have automatic children citizens? The idea is so far beyond even the outer limits of imagination. No human being who suggests it should be taken seriously.
Yeah, so just to add a little bit of context to this, in almost the entire world, citizenship is based on one of two categories. The first is called jus sanguinis, which basically means citizenship by blood. And the second is called jus soli, which means citizenship by soil, by land, right? So typically in Europe and large swaths of the world, citizenship is by blood. So either one or both of the parents must be a citizen in order for the child to inherit citizenship. Some countries actually have a mix where you have to have one or both parents born citizens and you have to be born in the land. But in almost all of the Americas, so North, Central, and South America, jus soli is what's common, right? Which means citizenship by soil, which means wherever you're born, that's where you're a citizen. So it's not some radical, crazy idea. It is pretty common in a whole bunch of countries, but I spent a while living in the Dominican Republic, and they actually have a very interesting situation there because they changed the rules. So they used to be jus soli as well, which means citizenship by land, but for many historical reasons, the Dominican Republic is much more successful of a country than Haiti is. Most notably because the Dominican Republic was controlled by the Spanish, who invested in schools and education and hospitals and stuff like that, whereas the Haiti was controlled by the French, who basically treated it as a slave colony. And then even when the Haitian slaves rebelled, and they were the first Black country to rebel against colonizers and achieve independence, and they did so successfully. But basically what happened was the rich and the kind of newly successful Haitians basically just treated everybody else like slaves as well. But the craziest part was that France said, hey, you guys stole our land and therefore you owe us reparations. And for 120 years, the country of Haiti was forced to pay reparations to the French. Until like 30 or 40 years ago was when they finally finished paying off reparations to the French, which is crazy and ridiculous. So the French really squeezed Haiti, destroyed all valuable land to create monocrops, notably sugar and stuff like that. Whereas the Dominican Republic also gained its independence. It was actually conquered by the Haitians for a short while there before they retook control. But so because there's this huge disparity between the quality of life in Haiti and the Dominican Republic, for many years, many Haitian women would come into the Dominican to have children there in order for those children to have citizenship. I think 5 or 10 years ago, obviously, this was causing crimes and a whole bunch of problems, obviously affecting the economy and everything else. And there's a limit because Haiti is a very populous country and a lot of people can flow into the Dominican Republic. And that was affecting a lot of people, and there was a lot of public pressure against it. They basically passed a rule that changed it from jus soli, citizenship based on land, to citizenship based on blood. And what they did, which is really crazy, is that they changed this rule retroactively. So not just for the future, anybody from now on, if you come in and you have a baby, they won't get Dominican citizenship. They actually changed it retroactively. And there were huge communities of hundreds of thousands, even millions of Haitian Dominicans who suddenly had their Dominican citizenship just taken away from them. And then the Dominican basically rounded them all up, and they actually still do this on a fairly regular basis. If you look Haitian, the police can stop you and question you, and if you don't have the right papers, even if you are legally in the Dominican, they will basically just take you to the border and shove you there. Now, the issue is many of these people were born in the Dominican Republic, and therefore they do not have Haitian citizenship. So suddenly, the country of Haiti, which is barely a country, it's mostly now, at least now, is completely just gangs. But they were like, you can't come here either because you're not Haitian. So the Dominicans kicked them out and stripped them from their Dominican citizenship. But the Haitians were like, we don't want you either. Plus, a lot of these people don't, their entire family could live in were living in the Dominican. So they don't have relatives or friends or family left, or at least they're in contact with in Haiti. So they really had nowhere to go. And now there are these like communities along the border that basically in the borderland, and these, I feel really bad for these people because there's an ancient verse from the Talmud that says that if a man has two wives, one is young and one is old, the younger wife will always pull out the white hairs that grow, and the older wife will always pull out the black hairs that grows. So it says mikan. He ends up bald from both ends. So I really feel bad for these people because they really ended up bald from both ends. Yeah, it's not unique birthright citizenship, but when it was created, Stephen Miller gave some really good context. It was basically to give the children of slave citizenship because they were born in the United States. So that was the idea originally. But also back then, if you emigrated to the United States, it was a big ordeal. To afford the cost of the ticket on the ship, you probably had to sell all of your belongings and collect money from friends and family who can possibly donate just to afford the ticket. And then you would take like a 2 to 3 month treacherous, dangerous voyage across the ocean in order to come to the United States. It's not like you're coming when you're 9 months pregnant to pop out a baby and them get the most valuable citizenship in the world. And especially back then, the United States wasn't necessarily the most valuable citizenship in the world. So the scenarios that were in place when the United States decided to become just soil, which means citizenship by land, made sense for then. Is it still relevant now? That is a question mark, but it is worth noting that Mexico and many countries in Central and South America, the vast majority of them, aside from the Dominican Republic notably, still have that type of citizenship. So it's not completely rare. It's much less common in Europe and Asia. Countries like Japan, it's basically impossible to become Japanese. Switzerland, I think, as well, is pretty hard. Specifically, Japanese are basically a single culture, and they're extremely strict on anybody. Even getting a visa to live there is hard, but becoming a citizen is basically impossible. So different countries have different rules, and it's not unique that the United States has birthright citizenship. But is it the time to change because the scenarios have changed? Possibly. You lived in South Florida. I did for a while too, and everybody knows that kind of certain areas of Miami are basically all Russians. And because a whole bunch of very rich Russians wanted their children to have citizenship, so when their wives were pregnant, they sent them to give birth in Florida, and many of them bought second properties. So there's this large Russian community in South Florida, and they're awesome. A lot of them are staunchly patriotic, etc. But it is just interesting because it's a way that people have been taking advantage of U.S. citizenship for a very long time. What do you think?
Yeah, no, again, it's like anything else. Sometimes you have to look at what the intent was, and absolutely, times have changed, and now transportation is easy and it's not an issue. And for people to just come over and take advantage of what really was for a small percentage of people that would actually ever qualify, now it's like a business. People are finding ways to get their families over here, pregnant, 9 months pregnant, to have a baby, and then all of a sudden, once the baby becomes a U.S. citizen when they're born, then the family can petition because they have a family member now that's a U.S. citizen. So I do think that, like we discussed earlier, all of this has to be looked at. Anything being abused needs to be considered. And one of the challenges we have is we do have people that are coming from other countries who don't have good intent. Gangs that didn't exist here, that are founded and operated in other countries, have taken a hold in U.S. cities. We have, obviously, in prior episode, we talked about the several now politicians that are trekking to El Salvador, the CICOT prison, to see what they can do about the one individual who was deported who was not a U.S. citizen. But we have other people who are here who are gang related or connected to gangs, and gangs that commit horrific crimes. We're not talking about petty theft, what have you. We're talking about dismembering people, torturing them, and so forth. We do have a clip here, another Maryland clip, actually just showing really the realities of what's going on U.S. soil right there in Maryland, the same state as we've been talking about for at least one or two other episodes. Let me just cue this up too.
Yeah, and the reason why this is so notable is because the way the media has been treating this criminal is Maryland Dad, Maryland Dad, Maryland Dad, right? That's his nickname, Maryland Dad. Not MS-13 gang member or Trenda Aragua friend. No, he's a Maryland Dad. But why is he a Maryland Dad? Notably because he has American children. So that really ties in very closely to the whole birthright citizenship, where it's like even cartel members will have their children here because then they're legally American and suddenly they qualify for all of the protections that the Constitution offers American citizens. Yeah, like you said, it seems like it's being abused and maybe it's time to change it. I'm open to that thought. I don't necessarily have final decisions, but it is definitely something worth considering, especially when you realize like this example is right on point.
Well, and there's a legal debate as to whether it needs to be changed or whether it needs to be interpreted differently than it's being interpreted now. But regardless, it needs to be looked at, because if there's, given what's been going on for the last few years, and millions of individuals who've been let into the country who are now being asked to leave, and in fact they are being asked to leave if they're not here with proper status, they're being given an opportunity to leave of their own volition, so that they'll have an opportunity to come back.
Now, this is the father of her children, Casey Barrera Rosa. He's charged with murder, and he's currently in ISIS custody. And we also have this mugshot of his uncle. Authorities charge Rolvin Barrera with being an accessory to the crime. A spokesperson for the Charles County Sheriff's Office says the suspect was methodical in hiding this woman's body, burying her deep, and using old dirt to conceal the hole.
Upon discovering her body, which was wrapped in a blanket and again buried about 5 feet below the ground, it was a moment of relief for the detectives that they were able to tell her family, we have found her.
So when we first reported this, authorities told us that they found fraudulent immigration documents for Barrera Rosa and confirmed he was in the U.S. illegally.
And that was brought to us by ABC7, the local ABC affiliate. The prior story was by Newsmax. Look, there's broad reporting about all these different things that are going on and the opinions of what should be done about it, right?
Yeah, I think this ties in fairly well, like we said, to the previous story, but also to the next clip you have. I think it's from Jesse Waters, and it's fairly comedic, but it does give a taste of what the constituents of Maryland actually think about their senator flying out to El Salvador to try and basically kidnap an illegal criminal and then illegally smuggle him into the United States, or at least pressure the government of El Salvador to commit those crimes for him. I don't know why the senator is acting against the interests of the United States, but apparently it's all for this Maryland dad.
And of course, for those that are not familiar, Jesse Waters Primetime, it does have a certain amount of satire and humor. And the roving reporter who went out obviously found some individuals who had a particular way of looking at things, but clearly they didn't have any trouble finding individuals with this point of view. It's about a minute long. The actual original story is much longer, but we cut it down to just give you a taste of it. Let me go ahead and cue that up.
He was living in Maryland, designated MS-13 terrorist, and Donald Trump deported him. How does that make you feel?
I feel safer.
He gotta go. He gotta go.
Need to go. That's it.
But he was a father.
But he's still a terrorist.
Okay, but there's children living without fathers now.
He should have picked and choose, so he picked to be a terrorist instead of worrying about his children.
The Democrats, they want him back. They say he was wrongfully deported. He has a wife and a kid who's a citizen. They're calling this a national emergency. Is this a national emergency?
I wouldn't call it a national emergency. We got more things going on.
We have more things, more fish to fry.
I just found out about it, so I don't think so. What kind of national emergency? For what? What is the emergency for?
Ain't no national emergency, no.
He was accused of hitting his wife twice and was a suspected human smuggler. Was he wrongfully deported?
No. He need to go.
If he's a smuggler, yeah, he need to be deported.
It's better to be safe than sorry.
It is better to be safe than sorry.
It is better to be safe than sorry. Yeah. It's hysterical and amusing. It's obviously ironic. The thing is that over the past few years, because the kind of woke extreme of the Democratic Party has been so dominant, even though they're a small minority that have been so dominant over the overall Democratic Party, and basically created a situation where they end up choosing the worst possible situations to take the side of them back. I am sure there was somebody who was falsely deported. It just makes sense. It's a numbers game. You're going to deport a whole bunch of people. Somebody's probably going to be falsely identified, falsely deported, especially when you're doing so with kind of emergency measures and without due process necessarily. So they don't have the traditional time to contest their deportation, etc., appeal, etc. So they don't really have any situation. So if the Democrats would find somebody who was really wrongfully deported, and originally there was some story of some gay barber in somewhere, maybe Arizona, or somebody who was like in his barbershop, completely American, and ICE wrongfully came in and deported him to CCOT, which is this El Salvador prison. I don't know if that's true or not. I haven't looked into it in depth enough, but find a real situation like that where it's just 100% completely innocent person and then get behind it, right? But no, the Democrats are so radical that who do they get behind? These terrorists, these cartel members, these human smugglers, these wife beaters, these assholes, right? That's the person, that's the fight you want to stand for. That's where you're going to plant your flag. Like, really? That's where you're going to say, this is where we draw the line. This is where we start fighting. But the Democrats have been doing this time and time again. And I think it's because this radical extreme left part of the party is so dominant over the silent majority, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, it certainly doesn't help the Democratic cause that there's so much effort being put at helping individuals that have committed all kinds of crimes already, that have alleged to commit other crimes, that were not here legally. I think there's certainly other individuals that perhaps could use the benefit of the assistance of the elected officials to help them sort out whatever the situation is, if they haven't committed any crimes, if they've been upstanding residents of the United States. But politics is like that. Oftentimes the politicians will go for what they think will rile up the crowds and get people to be cheering them on for whatever cause. Remember, here in America, we love to root for the underdog. The problem is you don't want to have the underdog be some mean dog that you really shouldn't be supporting. So I think a lot of this will play out. I think we will find that there were mistakes made at some point. They'll get better at this, and it's going to be unfortunate. But you know what caused this? The only reason we're in this predicament to begin with is that millions upon millions of people were let into this country without being properly vetted. That's the reality. That's the issue. And if not for that, we wouldn't be in this situation. Now it's an emergency, basically, and very serious measures are being taken. And unfortunately, there'll be some untoward side effects that hopefully could be mitigated and reduced as much as possible. But you know what? Life is a journey, and the goal is to keep your chin up and try to make sure that we're navigating forward correctly and doing what we need to do. Sometimes you even need to go and do things and visit places you've never been. So with that in mind, I think we have a story we want to end off with that we were talking about earlier. Great clip that we found about a guy with a full self-driving Tesla.
Yeah, everybody, it's time for the happy ending.
Here we go. This is actually an amusing story. What happens when you have a full self-driving Tesla and you ask the car to take you somewhere you've never been? Let's see what happens.
Tesla, take me somewhere I've never been before. Oh shit, where's it going?
This ought to be interesting.
Let's see where it takes us. Let's see.
That's good.
Wonder where it's going to take us. Like, it has to be just places we've never been in. Like, I wonder where it's
headed toward Mooresville.
Yeah. I've been to Mooresville. Where it's going? Pretty sick.
And that narrows it down. There's so many places off this exit. Been to most of them, though. Just about any eating restaurant around here.
It says we're pulling in.
Oh. I guess you've
Are
never
you
been there
shitting
before.
me?
So I pull them up in front of a Planet Fitness gym. For those listening but not seeing the video, let's just say that it appears that the AI in the Tesla believe that the two occupants of the car could probably do it a little more exercise.
Yeah, it's a little. It's funny because you see them and they're a little. You're around, kind of typical Americans, unfortunately. And yeah, it basically takes them to Planet Fitness when he says, "Take me to somewhere I've never been before." Yeah, it's funny and yeah, just a nice way to end this episode. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and we hope you
Kudos to
did.
them for their sense of humor. I think it's great that they
Yeah,
put that they did that video. I think
they
it's
actually posted it online. Yeah.
terrific as that. But yeah, I think that pretty much wraps up the episode 8. Wow, we're already episode 8. Here we go. Another one in the books. I think it's time
Awesome.
to go.
Thank you, Joe. Nice to talk to you.
Bye, yo. See you next time. Bye, everyone. Thanks for being here.